Hello, welcome to CGTN. Live from Beijing, I'm Pandem. The 15th edition of the BRICS Summit is underway in South Africa, as leaders from the 5 member countries are expected to make statements at a closed plenary session on Wednesday. The theme of this year's event is BRICS and Africa, Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development and Inclusive Multilateralism. CGTN will bring you an exclusive coverage on the event, exploring how the BRICS mechanism works and how it contributes to global economic stability. For more insight, joining us in the studio are Mr. Einar Tangen, political and economic affairs commentator, and Mr. Victor Gao, chair professor at Suzhou University. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Indeed. Now, let's start with this year's theme, a little bit long, BRICS and Africa. Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development and Inclusive Multilateralism. Let's start with this keyword, Africa. What does South Africa, what role does it play in this bloc?
First of all, South Africa is a member of the BRICS organization and a very important member in the African framework. For historical reasons, South Africa was one of the first countries to be industrialized in Africa, and South Africa today still has very higher level of education, industrial production, mining, you name it. So it's truly an outstanding, exemplary example of what an African country can be. It is also very well plugged in, politically speaking, not only as a member of the African Union, but also very importantly as a major hub linking the southern part of Africa to the rest of Africa above it. And China-African relations have been very solid. China supported the independence movement of the South African brothers and sisters when they fought against apartheid. And I think ever since South Africa has become a member of BRICS, China-South African relations has really developed by leaps and bounds. And Africa itself is one of the youngest continents in the world, and the African population is expanding very rapidly. It is expected that it will increase from more than 1 billion now to about 2 billion very soon. So there will be a lot of business opportunities in Africa, and China was, I think, the first country to engage with Africa on equal terms, because African continent for many decades was the forgotten continent as far as Western countries are concerned. By engaging with Africa, China emphasized equal treatment of all countries in Africa with China, truly brothers and sisters, and this reignited the wave of interest in African countries. And now Africa plays a very important role in China's push for the Belt and Road Initiative, and everyone realizes that connectivity will be of crucial importance to almost all African countries. And this is the excitement of this BRICS summit in Johannesburg, because it's not only about China and South Africa, but also China, all the BRICS members, and Africa as a whole.
Well, Mr. Tangen, do you think the voices of BRICS is representative enough for the larger developing world? Because we know originally BRICS, this very term, was coined on those so-called emerging markets, but socio-economically and sometimes politically, the very word emerging overlaps with the word developing. And let's take a look at this year's theme is calling for mutually accelerated growth. Why mutually accelerated? Does it speak directly to the rising tide of unilateralism?
Well, yes, and you know, in terms of what Victor said about South Africa, it's a very important voice because it really does speak for the global South. I mean, Russia and China are technically not part of the global South. They're an addition to it, but they have become the champions of it. But when you start seeing what South Africa has been willing to do, they stood up directly to Blinken when he showed up, and you remember that he said, "Oh, I don't want you to make a choice." And you know, the South African foreign minister said, "Well, that's strange, because 2 days before, your ambassador to the UN was telling me I had to make a choice." And I really do think that speaks to this whole global South and developing nations, and largely overlapping. So when you start talking about differences between emerging, overlapping, I think what you're really talking about is middle powers. And what you have here are 5 middle powers, and you have additional powers, countries, who want to join this kind of grouping. And the question is why, especially at this time? Well, when you, despite what Lula said about, well, we don't want to make this a counterpoint to the US or to the G7 or the G20, the fact is the issues that are necessary to and important the Global South, hunger, environmental issues, debt, development, etc., they have been largely ignored by the G7 and G20. So at this time, I think countries are saying, look, if we're going to do this, we have to start looking at themselves. There has to be a means of predictability. Otherwise, how are we going to do business? How are we going to have relations? And I think this is where China comes in. Xi Jinping's ideas about having initiatives around security, development, and civilization speak to a new kind of consensus-driven world order where developing countries as well as emerging countries, middle powers, powers who are trying to, at the bottom, they want to have something where they are respected. They're not patronized, they're not told what system that they have to obey or what country they have to knuckle under coercive power. They just want to develop and to be respected. And I think this is really what you're talking about. So get away from, I think, this idea of merging and developing. All of these countries have suffered under colonialism. So that is what they share.
Well, gentlemen, we'll be getting back to you very soon on this. And for more on the BRICS summit, let's cross live to our correspondent, Ravinder Bauer in Delhi. Ravinder, you've been following this very closely from the political heart of India. So what can we expect from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's statement at the BRICS summit?
Well, what we saw during the BRICS, leader summit, which happened on the business forum, where Mr. Narendra Modi spoke about India's economic growth story. That is something he emphasized upon on Tuesday in his speech to the leaders, and in that he spoke about the fact that how India is going to emerge as a big economic power in the coming years. India will. He highlighted the fact that India is one of the fastest growing economies, and it will be a 5 trillion economy in the years to come. So this is something that he spoke about, highlighting the fact that India's reforms, economic reforms that the government has done in the last few years, also the technological leap that India has taken will actually make it one of the economic leaders in the future. These are the facts he spoke about, and what we are expecting today, of course, that Prime Minister will be raising issues like terrorism and security issues. He will also be talking about, cooperation, so that the global South will do better and will emerge as a global power, the global South. That is something he is going to emphasize upon. And once again, which everybody in India is expecting, that he will speak about India's stand on the war and the urgency to end the war and to come on the diplomacy and dialogue table. This is something that is expected in his speech today. His special message will be that of mutual trust and transparency, so that the global cooperation, global South cooperation will do well, and that is how the global South can do better. And these are some things we are expecting today from the Prime Minister in his statement.
Thank you very much, our correspondent Ravinder Bauer in Delhi. Now let's cross live to our correspondent Daniel Arapmoy in Johannesburg, the very host city of this time's BRICS summit. Daniel, what can we expect from the president of the host nation?
Well, quite a lot is happening here in Johannesburg, and this morning it is a closed session, plenary session, where the leaders will be discussing quite a number of issues. And one of the key areas that the leaders are looking at this morning here in Johannesburg is how to realize the full potential of BRICS for inclusive global economic recovery and sustainable development. Now, we all understand that the BRICS members were badly hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also looking at the question of rising food prices and fuel prices, that has affected many of the countries within the BRICS group of nations. The leaders will be discussing ways of how to help these countries and their members recover from some of these challenges that they have faced for quite a long time now. Secondly, they're also looking at strengthening a mutual beneficial partnership with Africa and the global south in a multipolar world. Now, we are looking at the question of how the conflict in Ukraine has exacerbated the challenges of security. Now, the leaders will be discussing ways of coming up with a common voice to address key security challenges that affect the bloc and the globe at large. They are also looking at deepening and strengthening progressive multilateralism, something that President Cyril Ramaphosa talked about yesterday quite extensively. He talked about protectionism that is hampering the economic development, the global economic development. So the leaders will be discussing ways of how to address this challenge of protectionism that many countries have been talking about for a long time. This has been one of the key agenda of this summit that is taking place here in Johannesburg. And finally, one of the areas that is rarely discussed or talked about is the question of protecting the rights of women in conflict. We all know that women are one of the most vulnerable groups when it comes to the issue of conflict. The leaders here today will be discussing how to protect the women. Yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa did mention that international financial institutions should put more money into women-run business to help strengthen their capacity to cope in times of challenges. This is what we are looking forward to this morning and the afternoon.
Thank you very much, our correspondent Daniel Ratmoy in Johannesburg. Now let's go to Alyosha Milankovic in Moscow. Alyosha, Russian President Vladimir Putin is expected to deliver a speech via video link. What could be the top items on the agenda?
We assume that most interesting parts of his speech would be addressing the process of de-dollarization, the process of emerging markets, which BRICS countries are, and the connection between global south, how he frequently refers to the countries, to the developing countries south of equator, between Russia and the global south, opening further transport corridors, increasing not just transportation between those two parts of the world, but also opening new corridors, North Sea route, north to south corridor via Iran. And these are the elements the Russian president would most likely address. He also most likely going to further expand his comments about growing power of the BRICS countries. He mentioned that 26% of the world GDP is now at this moment in the hands of the BRICS countries. But he also said that purchasing power is roughly around 31%, and it is more than G7 countries combined together already, according to him. Those countries, BRICS countries, surpassed in certain areas G7 countries, and that is expected to expand. He also mentioned that mutual investments between the BRICS countries increased by 20%. And this is really, really huge. He also mentioned, and he is most likely going to speak about very important things of export of Russian fertilizer and grain. Because as we know, since the Ukraine crisis started, exports of grain from Russia and fertilizers from Russia, just the same as exports of grain from Ukraine, were seriously troubled and are affecting the global food prices. He is saying that Russia is going to increase exports of both fertilizers and grain to the global south, to the countries which are affected the most. And it is a process. It is something that it is not going to happen overnight. It is a long process, but at the end it is going to open much more mutual business opportunities between the BRICS countries. He also most likely going to speak about the de-dollarization. This is something that Russia is very much interested in, and maybe, just maybe, as we spoke with Russian finance ministers a couple of days ago, maybe he will also speak about the new BRICS currency. This is something that it is very frequently circulated here. We spoke about that with Russian finance minister Silvanov a couple of days ago about that, and there is a ongoing negotiations about this future currency, the BRICS currency. This is not something that it is going to happen tomorrow. This is also a long process, but maybe Russian president would address that as well during his speech.
Thank you very much, our correspondent Alyosha Milankovic in Moscow. Now let's cross live to my colleague Tian Wei at our Johannesburg studio. Hello, Tian Wei.
Hello to you, Pandeng. Good morning from Johannesburg. This is the very early morning show from this part of the world, trying to bring all the latest things that are happening right now and likely to take place later today. We know that there were enormous amount of achievements between the bilateral agreements, South Africa and China taking place yesterday and today. The BRICS leaders are going to be where I am right here at the Sandton Convention Center for their own version of how to build better the BRICS community and also expansion of the BRICS. And this morning I'm having in our studio Amir Ibrahim, a climate investor who has been very active this time during the BRICS Business Council meeting yesterday, and certainly watching on behalf of the business community of what is going on among the political leaders. So good morning to you, Amir.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Now, there were a lot of news that needs to be digested. Starting from yesterday, let's briefly jump on that. First of all, the agreement between China and South Africa on building manufacturing centers near the raw material production center. This is one of the most important things for many South Africans. Tell me more about what's your observation from the business perspective.
Well, it was incredibly insightful to hear the commentary from South African President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday, who really highlighted the commitment from South Africa to aspire to not only be a source of raw materials in the future, but actually looking at finished goods and products. They really want to accelerate development of their value chain in relation to trade. So I think that is something that particularly for the relationship between South Africa and China will be a very, very key component of the future economic and trade relationship. And further, that will also see South Africa's economic development accelerate in the near future.
And meanwhile, yesterday on Tuesday, we also had a presser coming from Director General of the African Department from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, starting with the statement that he made that African continent and emerging economies want China to support industrialization, not just infrastructure anymore. So this is something very new this time.
It is something new, and I think that what we are also learning from the commentary from leaders and certainly from the discussions that have taken place so far in the Business Forum and other spaces at the BRICS conference is that development is not confined to, as you mentioned, just infrastructure development. You're also looking at skills development. You're looking at the key
know-how,
broader ecosystem development around developing jobs that will be sustainable for the future. I think that also looking at South Africa's demographic component and understanding that the continent has an exceptionally young population and workforce.
Absolutely.
And actually thinking about how this will be developed in the future in a long-term sustainable manner is a key benefit, not only for the continent, but for the world and certainly the BRICS
And
community.
that means a lot for investors like you and many of your colleagues from different parts of the BRICS economy. I'm going to ask that a bit later. But let's focus on the BRICS leaders meeting today. They are going to come in around 10 o'clock local time, which is just about 10 minutes, I guess, from now. So they are likely to make their statements one by one. Certainly, these are going to be important ideas coming from their own perspective about the future of BRICS, about currencies to be used among the BRICS economies, about the so-called global south, emerging economies, developing countries, their future agenda, about how they are going to look at the geopolitics today, how they are going to look at the development agenda today. So on those issues, as an investor, what are you looking at? What are you expecting?
Well, certainly the sentiment and the comments that have been made around de-dollarization and looking at how the world may continue to support the flow of capital in the 21st century is a key topic of debate. I think the commentary that we heard from the Brazilian president at the Business Forum yesterday, President Lula da Silva, who highlighted that actually engaging in trade in terms of local currencies is something that I believe the BRICS leaders are looking at quite closely, and indeed other countries. So this is a very interesting development because as we see exchange rates fluctuate, etc., it is not always beneficial to potentially look at trading within a foreign currency. So trade within local currencies, for example, if South Africa is trading with India, that is something that seems to be on the agenda. In relation to
However, de-dollarization, just to be clear, has not been a consensus yet. We heard from the financial ministers yesterday taking place their meeting on site of the BRICS summit in Cape Town. Actually, they are discussing, but lack of consensus at this moment. Yet what they have in consensus is the use of local currencies and more currency swap, as they say, in the international trade.
That's absolutely correct. I think that there has not been any, I think, clear consensus highlighted around looking at an alternative specifically to the dollar necessarily in relation to global trade flows. What has been highlighted is, again, as you mentioned, looking at local currencies being used for trade. And this is something that we've seen in many other parts of the world. I mean, historically, oil markets were used as a benchmark to look at how the US dollar was used, obviously, as the key currency for capital flows. But indeed, we're now seeing countries trade oil in local currencies. You know, we saw recently between the Gulf and indeed China that now you see Chinese yuan being used in relation to the purchase of oil. So there are changes taking place in the broader context, and I think that's something that certainly the BRICS community is certainly observing very closely.
Right, and the New Development Bank, of course, is part of that conversation. The New Development Bank that has been initiated by the BRICS members. Everybody contribute to the same proportion to make it work. It's mainly working on development agendas. Recently, it has issued the RAND version of the possibility projects, and it's doing very well in the international market as far as I know. For investors like you, what does that say to you? There seems to be more variety.
Yes, I mean, we've certainly seen the development of new multilateral development banks over recent years. Of course, the new development bank is also headquartered in China, which is quite significant.
In Shanghai.
In Shanghai, yes. And in recent years, China has really sought to become an international leader in relation to development finance. You also see the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, which although not directly linked to BRICS, it shows China's role in actually being an international leader in looking at how MDBs can play a key role in development finance. For the BRICS, for the New Development Bank, which has also been coined as the BRICS Bank, there certainly is, you know, a huge amount of scope to look at not only within BRICS countries, but indeed from a broader context, particularly if BRICS membership were to expand in the future, what the opportunities may be around development. Because the key role, I think, around BRICS and the sentiment from the leaders does relate to the development of developing and emerging economies. And it's very interesting how those two terms are used, because I think that there are certain key components of each of those terms that signify slightly different things from an investment standpoint and indeed economic development.
This is a very interesting point. We can go more in depth into this, Amir. But you know, one of the things that we have noticed here in this Senton Convention Center, where the BRICS leaders are to speak very soon, is that it's not just the BRICS economies are here, not just the so-called global south, emerging economies and developing countries, but also coming from the developed economies. I understand a lot of bankers coming from developed economies are here on their personal agenda or journal, and also here as a private observer about the business opportunities and investment opportunities likely to be enormous over here. So I think it's a very interesting world we are seeing today, Amir.
Well, I think that the commentary yesterday, particularly from President Ramaphosa around the fact that BRICS is not seeking to replace necessarily other multilateral forums such as the G7, such as the G20. What BRICS is seeking to do is to be a representative for its membership, but indeed I think it is also looking to engage with the wider international community. And as you mentioned, there are a very large number of representatives from the developed countries, countries that are not associated with BRICS officially, but we've seen many investors and other business officials from Europe, from North America in attendance here. And I think that the opportunity that is here, you know, to really look at the future of development. Demographics are going to play a huge role in the 21st century. And indeed, when you look at the African continent today, and I believe there are more than 40 African leaders in attendance here at the BRICS Summit. But when you look at the African continent today, there are approximately 1.3 billion people. That is projected to grow to 4.5 billion by the end of the century. So in actually looking...
And many of them are quite well educated, for example, from South Africa.
From South Africa, you have a very, very educated youth community particularly.
Indeed.
And that presents tremendous opportunities for business and other institutions to really invest here in the future and seek development within that context.
Talking about future, I also want to emphasize with you, Amir, about the new energy and sustainable development. I see you're a climate investor. So let's focus a bit on that. SDGs for the 2030, we're already at the midpoint. Later in September, middle September, the UN is going to host the SDG Midpoint Summit. Looking at what has been done and what has been not, actually a lot has not been achieved, even some setbacks over the years. So now looking at how the global south are coming together and all their agendas mentioning about new energy, sustainable development, what kind of synergy and dynamism this is likely to bring to even put forward to the global agenda this time?
Well, we see from the commentary yesterday from the CEO of Standard Bank here in South Africa that there are aspirations to commit, I believe, over 260 billion rand over the next 3 years to sustainable finance and development. What South Africa as one African state is seeking to do is become an international leader within this space. The SDGs obviously cover a broader area, not only looking at climate and environmental sustainability, but other forms of development. And I think that in relation to leadership within this space, in whether it's mitigating poverty, whether it's looking at gender equality, enhancing education, we've seen African nations be some of the key contributors to this, and actually looking at some of the proxy measures of development. Some African states, since the initiation of the SDGs, have seen the furthest development compared to some developed countries.
Let's focus on energy. Infrastructure for energy and also new energy as well. This is the key for investors like you. And this is also the key likely to be discussed by the BRICS leaders. Many of their countries are facing challenges and both opportunities as well of new energy. Here in South Africa, we understand electric cars are being used, electric buses are running on the street, even though charging station could be a challenge. But at the same time, we also see solar energy. This is going to be one of the most promising places in the world. So how do you see investment like this coming from a financial investment perspective, and also coming from building infrastructure to make sure the financing can go to the right place and make it sustainable?
So some of the discussion that I have observed, certainly amongst individuals and business representatives here focused on energy, in looking at solar particularly, so South Africa aspires not only to be a source of solar energy, but they also want to be looking at the value chain in relation to the development of infrastructure that will actually be contributing to the energy transition. There are key synergies that exist. If you're looking at the BRICS members specifically, you know, I was only in Shandong province several weeks ago, where I learned about the solar industry there, and we had an opportunity to visit some local sites with business officials and learn that the key role that Shandong province in China is playing in relation to renewables, both in relation to solar and wind. So if you look at those key relationship drivers and how China and South Africa can actually be partners, where not only China would look at South Africa as an investment opportunity, but looking at joint ventures and other opportunities for development. These are some of the aspects of financialization that can play a key role in looking at how this space can be developed in the future.
That's an important point, because we want to refer back to the joint statement made by both the Chinese and the South African president. In their joint statement, it specifically said mutual investment will be made by both sides into each other's countries. So I guess this is one of the areas that we are talking about. But Go ahead, please.
So just 2 nights ago, I was at the Business Leaders Welcome Dinner here for BRICS. And some of the commentary there from the ministers highlighted that South Africa is not only looking at direct inward investment, and they actually want to play a key role in being an investor in the future as well. So I think when you really are taking note of that sentiment, you understand the aspirations here in South Africa are for that mutual beneficial cooperation. They're not only looking to be a recipient, but indeed look at their global investment opportunities as well in the future.
Talking about energy, electricity, one of the most important components when it comes to use the new energy, such as solar, is storage. So how can you store all these electricity and make sure it will go into the electricity web, as they say, the network? That is an important thing. And in order to make that components, which is for the storage, many of the raw materials coming from the African continent is crucial. Lithium, and the list goes on. So it seems that there is a lot of synergy to make that happen. Not only raw materials, manufacturing of that, and then bring it to the global supply chain, which will benefit all emerging economies. Amir.
I think that is a very important point, and certainly one of the things that came out of the pandemic, and indeed recently with international conflict, has been looking at energy security. And indeed, when you look at supply chains, nearshoring is something that is taking place across the world. Africa plays a key role in relation to the enormous resources that obviously the continent holds. So the opportunity for development, as you mentioned, not only in relation to the extraction of raw materials and then selling that in a commodity context for trade purposes, but also looking at how the African continent can play a key role in developing and being innovative in relation to energy infrastructure, is something that indeed we've heard leaders here reflect on and certainly indicate in relation to their aspirations for the future.
Yeah, this is all many of the things that we're looking at, but there's another thing very important about the expansion of BRICS. Now, yesterday, on Tuesday evening, the leaders of the BRICS economies, they already had their retreat. When they're having a retreat, it means they are discussing in private about some of the topics they're interested in putting to the public today and tomorrow. So one of the things must be about the expansion. Earlier we heard already coming from the South African organizer, likely 23 countries already formally applied to join the BRICS. Of course, more than 40 already expressed their interest in knowing more and about the potential of BRICS. So on the expansion, how do you see on the one side, Amir? The president of South Africa, as the host country, made already very clear, is now in competition for so-called the G7 and many others. But at the same time, this is going to be an important voice concerted from the global South.
It is a very significant area of development. I mean, I would say that certainly the dialogue that has been expressed from leaders and indeed just attendees here and other delegates has signified that there is not yet broad or unanimous consensus over how a potential expansion would be developed in the future. One of
standards, rules, who will be eligible, all of this list that needs to be discussed.
Absolutely, yeah. And the only country, so initially, BRICS obviously, the term BRIC was the original acronym, and that came out of a research paper by a Goldman Sachs economist in the early 2000s. South Africa was added to the bloc in 2010.
2010, yes,
and
with the introduction of China as well.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And what we have seen since that period obviously has been a mutual cooperation and the common goals that the countries currently within the membership have as developing and emerging economies are looking at how they can sustainably develop for the future and in relation to how their populations can continue to benefit from economic cooperation and other forms of engagement.
Right.
What has been highlighted is that there is a very broad contingent of countries from across the world globally that have expressed that they share mutual interests with the BRICS membership. And they aspire to join the BRICS community, I think, because of some of these shared interests. They recognize the synergies that exist in relation to their own economies.
Yeah.
And these are countries that are very geographically dispersed from
Absolutely.
Argentina and South America. We have seen countries that indeed have currently very prosperous economies, including the UAE and Saudi Arabia within the Gulf, and other countries across the world.
Right.
So they're quite diverse, but they obviously see mutual areas of cooperation that can be mutually beneficial for the future. I think that the context around selective admission is something that has certainly been hinted at, where admission to the BRICS community won't necessarily become an open forum, but indeed there may be certain criteria they would look to develop for
as a
for
journalist,
membership.
one of the things you do is to read the signs coming from different sides and trying to put them together as clues for possible answers on important questions. Yesterday, we heard the speeches coming from the 5 presidents. Of course, some were delivered by their representatives, such as the Minister of Commerce from China, representing the Chinese president. But looking at the speech made by the Chinese president, almost late last night, Beijing time, he talked a lot about philosophical choices that the global South and the world needs to make, whether it's confrontation or cooperation, whether it's division or complementary. And the list that goes on. And of course, he also brought out a series of proposals that China made to the world in order to support the Global Sustainable Development Goal, SDGs, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilizations Initiative, including the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative as well. All of these China proposed to support the global goals, sustainable development goals. Having said that, though, we also heard, Amir, this is a long question, but I need to get the context here. The South African president, Mr. Ramaphosa, the host country, talking about how are we going to make our choices in terms of international governance system, in terms of international financial system. He also mentioned we are at a critical juncture. That point has been confirmed by the other 3 leaders coming from Brazil, India, of course, a video report, a video speech also delivered by the Russian president as well. So everybody agrees on that. Yet the question is how to move to the next step. Amir, about that, how do you see this global South terminology? We heard that decades ago, when there was anti-colonial movement going on in the world. Now that word has been very much of attention again, but certainly very different circumstances. So tell me more about your understanding of this and your understanding of the messages given by the leaders yesterday in indication about what they are likely to propose today.
Well, I think the key term that you used there was around governance, and indeed this idea around international governance and what may or may not symbolically be the current world order and whether or not it is working for all members of the international community, I think is something that was attached to the sentiments that were certainly outlined by leaders yesterday. I think that what certainly came out the speech that was delivered by the Commerce Minister from China by President Xi Jinping did highlight that China is looking at mutual cooperation around the world. What was certainly highlighted was that they're not necessarily looking to become the global hegemon. And I think that was something that was implicitly indicated within the delivery of the speech, but they are looking to cooperate with the international community, with the BRICS community, and indeed play a key role in relation to sustainable development in the future. What President Ramaphosa also highlighted, he did make some commentary, I believe, referring to non-alignment historically, which obviously was
back in the 1950s, isn't it? The Bandung Conference.
Absolutely, which was a period that reflected the consensus among some countries, particularly within the African continent and the global South, who were not looking to align on one side between East and West during the Cold War.
Indeed.
Now, you can potentially draw from that, 2 conclusions. One can be quite concerning, that the international community may now be entering into a period of new power rivalry and potential confrontation in whatever form that may take. But certainly we're looking, there is indications here that the world may be becoming more bipolar. Now obviously when you're looking at international development, and indeed one issue that affects every single country and every single person on earth, climate change, looking at that separation and that bipolarization is not beneficial to anyone.
No.
And I think that is something that certainly leadership here from South Africa and other African states are very aware of, and actually looking at how their own countries and their economies may be impacted in the short to medium term by the impacts of climate change. So they are not seeking to align with one political ideology necessarily. I think what is certainly coming out of the sentiment from leaders, particularly delivered through President Ramaphosa's speech, was that South Africa and the African continent want to play a key role and be integrated into the global economy.
Indeed.
They want to see their populations benefit from future prosperity. And indeed, there's a tremendous opportunity in the 21st century to look at the mistakes that have been made historically, particularly when you look at areas like colonialization and
the Cold War.
And the Cold War and suppression of certain communities, and actually looking at how cooperation through global forums is something that can be achieved. We're very close to the UN General Assembly in a few weeks' time, and I think that is something certainly that the leadership here is also very aware of, that the international community will be observing the outcomes from this summit in September in New York.
I noticed tremendous sense of pragmatism in the air, Amir, believe it or not, at this complex geopolitical time. In fact, a lot of people that we have been talking to, both you and I, business community, and maybe some of the government officials, is they want to make sure there will be good economy. They want to make sure their people have jobs. They also want to make sure that there will be concerted efforts coming from the developing and emerging economies to match their economic status with their political status on the international stage. So this sense of pragmatism seems to be pretty much part of the voice coming from the global south. That's what I have noticed.
Absolutely, and I think that for the global south, you know, communities today are technologically integrated, and I think that young people are aware of the developments internationally.
This is a very important point.
And when you look at the adoption of internet usage, which is continuing to grow within the developing world and indeed the global south, that is a proxy that can signify that certainly the aspirations of young people within these countries are to be key members of the international community, to see economic development within their nation.
I want to tap into this point very specifically, but before we go there, let's finish about this expansion thing. Today will be the BRICS leaders. They are talking to one another. They are likely to make statements and speeches. Eventually, they might be coming to consensus made to the public. Tomorrow, on Thursday rather, see how time flies. On Thursday, we are going to see the BRICS leaders meeting the African continent, meaning the leaders coming from many African nations. They are going to meet with the BRICS leaders. So about the expansion, on the one hand, we still do not know how it would work. But we know, on the other hand, already from the official agenda, that many of the leaders are tapping into these activities and opportunities very proactively.
So I think that this is something, so I believe now, as you mentioned, over 20 countries have formally expressed interest in joining, and there has been sentiment from over 40 countries internationally that see the BRICS as a forum that they would aspire to become engaged with in the future. It is a diverse contingent of international countries that seek membership, as we have previously discussed.
Especially from the African continent, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think also within Africa, you know, the African Union will obviously play a key role within all of this as the representative body of countries across the continent. And South Africa, indeed, I have certainly been very moved by the fact that South Africa recognises its current membership and role within the BRICS community not only in confinement to their own country, but they indeed want to be a voice for Africa within this international forum. And I think that certainly that is testament to the fact that there are mutual areas of development that indeed African states see, and they are looking currently to South Africa as the only African continental member of the BRICS Forum to be, I suppose, a representative within this space. Every member of the BRICS current membership are members of the G20, for example. So if there was broader membership, if that was indeed approved to all aspiring members, not all members would necessarily have representation in some of those other forums, such as the G20. But I think indeed the opportunity for the expansion indeed also presents other areas of development. So indeed, if you're looking at potentially some of the Gulf countries becoming members in the future, that presents opportunities for oil trade and indeed other areas as well.
On Africa, once again, we know that there is the African Union playing an instrumental role in bringing Africa together politically. There's also African economic zones that we are seeing right now actively taking place. So a lot of pan-African activities are going on as we speak. Before we go, one final point on the young people. This is not a minor topic. This is a major topic. If you talk to everybody here you meet at the Senten Center. So how to create a platform of the future for the young people coming from the BRICS countries. This should be part of the important component of what the leaders are thinking today.
Well, I mean, this is an area that is certainly very close to my heart. In previous years, I also served from my own country's membership of various global forums. I was a youth representative to the G7, the G20, and other multilateral
You also
forums.
studied in China at Tsinghua University and also in Europe as well. So a lot of things going on among the younger generations.
And that opportunity to actually play a leadership role at a young age is something that is so important for every country. And I think that one of the things that I am incredibly inspired to learn when I travel around the world is this call to action from young people. They are looking at the key issues around the world today, whether it's climate change, whether it's equality, whether it's economic development. And indeed, young people in Africa, I mean, if you look, demographics in Africa are absolutely fascinating. The average age in Europe currently is around 40. The average age in Africa is around 18. So when you are looking at the growth in the future, if you're looking at those long-term trajectories, this is a very youthful part of the world. And indeed, as the population continues to grow, young people have an increasingly more significant voice in relation to international governance. I think for BRICS, there is a tremendous opportunity for the bloc to, in the near future, look at youth representation, and that's hopefully something we'll see in the short term.
Right. Final point, very briefly from you. When the leaders are speaking, very shortly, likely this morning, coming from the BRICS countries, what do you expect some of the important points they need to touch on in order to answer to their constituencies back at home, and certainly the global south?
So certainly environmental sustainability, this is something that affects all members and all communities. I think another area that was highlighted by the Brazilian president was the importance of people-to-people exchanges. Indeed, looking at not only how the relationship will be on a political and economic level, but indeed how communities across the bloc currently, and indeed more internationally, can continue to be integrated in the 21st century.
Amir Ibrahim, what a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I hope you're enjoying your day today, running around.
It's been a fantastic morning, and it's been fantastic to meet yourself. Thank you.
It's wonderful to bring a lot of rich information coming from the participants of the meetings at the Senten Center. A lot of things are going on, Pandeng, here. Energy in the air, pragmatism in the air. Of course, there's also consensus and the building of consensus once you meet in the, whether in the media center, also in the meeting halls on the sideline of the BRICS leaders meeting. We are CGTN here at the Senten Convention Center, bringing all our audience from all over the world much updated information as they come out. Back to you in Beijing, Pandeng.
Thank you very much, my colleague Tian Wei in Johannesburg. You're watching a special live coverage on CGTN, focusing on the ongoing BRICS summit in Johannesburg. Now, for more insight, let's talk to guests in our Beijing studio. So, gentlemen, let's focus a little bit on the sustainable development, another focus of the BRICS leaders this time. Aina, as you earlier mentioned, that the BRICS is representative enough for the global south. If that's the case, Professor, do you think challenges are also rising? Because when we're talking about sustainable development, it sounds forward-looking, but let's go back to the harsh reality. Many countries in the global south are now facing the very survival challenge, that is food security. And that's exactly why earlier our correspondent Alicia Milankovic in Moscow mentioned that Russia has proposed to lower the prices of fertilizers and food for those countries in need. Tell us the pressure here.
Well, first of all, when we talk about the global south, I think by definition it includes the BRICS members. Because the BRICS members are a very important part of the global south. Now, this is at a time when certain countries like the United States try to split the global south. They call China as a developed country, meaning China is no longer qualified as a member of the global south. But the reality is just the opposite. I think China and all the other BRIC member states are fully justified to continue to be the member states of the global south. Now, when we look at about global south countries, more than 160 in total, then they have completely different circumstances. Some are still mired in abject poverty. Starvation is a major problem, for example. Some are mired in dilemmas of figuring out what is the growth path going forward, and some need to transit from agricultural society to industrialization, modernization, urbanization, you name it. Different global south member states have very, very different circumstances. Now, one thing is of common characteristic for all of them. Regardless of your national circumstance, each of the global south countries need to achieve sustainable development in their own way because they face very different circumstances. Now, sustainable development, in my view, need to be achieved by caring for the well-being of the people, to achieve inclusive development, to achieve more or less egalitarian or equal benefits for the people who do work. And then you also need to create a situation
Indeed,
where...
let's go to Johannesburg. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived at the summit venue of this year's BRICS leaders meeting. This is live footage from Johannesburg in South Africa. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived at venue of this year's BRICS summit. Earlier, Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in South Africa on a Tuesday and for a state visit to the country. Now, President Xi Jinping is attending the BRICS summit. So continue our discussion, Professor Gao.
Yeah, the other thing is that whatever economic development you achieve, you need to really care for environmental protection. So economic, including industrial development on the one hand, but also environmental protection on the other hand. Otherwise, there will be no sustainability of your development. Now, the other thing is that among the global south, I think there need to be a joint effort to make sure that each and all global south member states need to develop more or less at the same time, because no one should be left behind, no one should be left out of the excitement of the economic development. And I think the BRICS framework is really emphasizing on equal development, everyone included in the development, sustainable development, inclusive development, and all these, I think, constitute important parts of the overall sustainability for the global south countries.
Right, having said that, Mr. Tangen, for BRICS countries, what do you make of the potential of the each development and, of course, their joint development as a grouping, as the world is now full of increasing uncertainties? Because earlier, due to estimates, the BRICS countries contribute to over 30% of global GDP currently, and that's expected to rise to over 50% by the year 2030. Of course, that's the best case scenario. But do you think that's also partially why those BRICS members are calling for inclusive multilateralism? this time to deal with rising uncertainties and challenges?
Well, there's certainly a lot of headwinds out there. I don't necessarily always agree that it's possible to just do everything all at once for everybody. And that's one of the challenges that the BRICS have. These are middle powers. They have a tremendous amount of influence. And if you go down the existing five, you have Russia, huge resources, okay? Brazil, the same. South Africa, the same. India is not resources, but it's emerging a very large population. But that could be a positive or a negative, especially given fairly low amounts of reading and writing and things like literacy and things like that. China is a production base. And the way they can work together can be very good, but how to spread that to other nations, especially developing nations. China's idea has always been, look, what is holding them back is the fact that they have resources, they have things they could develop, but they don't have the means to get them to market. So the Belt and Road Initiative was always about connectivity, infrastructure connectivity. And unfortunately, it's been opposed, ironically, by the developed nations, especially the United States, who keep saying, well, it's just debt. The whole point is, until you get the whole thing working, any one piece is not going to be worth it. It's all the pieces together, working together. It's like an engine. If I give you, one piston and say, oh, let's go, you'll say, no, it's worthless. But if I put the whole engine together, then it is something. It can power something. So this is the kind of headwind that China is facing and a lot of the other countries. Then the question comes, let's look at this in a microcosm. You have 200 nations roughly in the world. All right, you have 160 of them in the global south, developing, emerging, etc. They're in some ways competitors with each other. So the key is, how do you construct a system in which you can have friendly competition, where countries can start to develop their own sense of their strategic advantage, a competitive advantage, let us say, and then try to work on that. Every country is not going to be a rubber stamp of the next country just because they have the same size or certain characteristics. They're always different. So, what China is doing with its security initiative, development initiative, and civilization initiative is trying to say, listen, here's a system that works under consensus, not corporatism, not I have 51% or I'm bigger than you are, so I'm going to tell you what to do, or I'm going to tell you how you should be. It is, we are different countries, but we have to have some sort of system. And the closest I can come is the Westphalian system. That's when the Christians, Catholics and Protestants got so tired of killing each other that they literally said, look, what happens in your country, we know where the border is, that's your business. What happens in ours is our business, and we can trade, and we can try to rebuild. And I think China isn't coming from that negative inference, but they're really saying, look, we have to have a system that everyone understands and respects, that allows us to pursue our individual abilities.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your input. We'll be getting back to you on this. You're watching a special live coverage on CGTN on BRICS Summit. Stay with us.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
From the 1,035-kilometer railway linking China to Laos, facilitating connectivity and boosting economic growth in the landlocked Southeast Asian country, to the joint China-Saudi Arabia photovoltaic project to harness renewable energy in the oil-dependent kingdom. The Belt and Road Initiative has come a long way since it was first proposed in 2013, complementing the development strategies of partner countries and building on their existing strengths.
开创合作共赢的新模式。
The Belt and Road Initiative, linking the world in the pursuit of common prosperity for humanity.
You're watching CGTN. Chinese President Xi Jinping called on China and South Africa to strengthen their partnerships on his state visit to the African nation. China has remained South Africa's largest trading partner for 14 years. Now, my colleague Michelle is standing by with more on ties between the two sides. Hello, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Pendong. First, let's take a look at the joint statement released by China and South Africa, in which the two sides highlighted their ties in trade and economy. The two countries are committed to further improve the current trade structure, market access, and two-way investment. They have pledged to keep industrial and supply chains stable and secure. China is South Africa's largest global trading partner, and South Africa is China's largest trading partner in Africa. Both nations have agreed to cooperate more in multiple fields within the Belt and Road Initiative framework, a platform they recognize to be beneficial for international cooperation. China is taking the lead in global investment in the African continent. That's according to Africa's Development Dynamics Report, jointly published by the African Union Commission and the OECD Development Center. The report says China's greenfield investment in Africa from 2017 to 2022 reached $74 billion, accounting for 18% of the continent's total inbound greenfield investment. China is the biggest investor in East Africa, taking up 1/5 of its capital inflow. New investment in Africa from China reached $1.8 billion in the first half of this year, up 4.4%. More than 3,000 Chinese companies have run business operations in Africa, with 70% of those being private enterprises. Now, for more on the role of Chinese enterprises in the 2023 BRICS Summit, we're joined by Conrad David Greenwald, COO of GWM Havel South Africa. Hi there, Mr. Greenwald. So how is GWM supporting the 2023 BRICS Summit? Could you also shed light on GWM's advancements in South Africa, especially in terms of market reception?
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for the opportunity. I think it's a great privilege for GWM in South Africa to be part of the BRICS Summit in South Africa. So we were fortunate enough to liaise with the Department of International Relations and Cooperation and provide them with vehicles for their logistical team to ensure that we've got a fluent event in South Africa and hosting all of the participants. We've also made significant inroads in South Africa, and I think we are a regular competitive top 10 in vehicle sales in South Africa. As a result of that, we felt like it's time to give back to the business community in South Africa.
Now, given the current prominence of load shedding in South Africa, do you have any reservations on the impending launch of GWM's electric vehicle in the country?
Yeah, I think it's a relevant question and a very good question. We do have or did have some concerns, but I think we did some research in South Africa over the last couple of years, getting ready for Aura launch in South Africa. We don't have a high volume expectation. Our aim is to get the most affordable electric vehicle in South Africa, to change the ownership perception and service experience around EVs. And based on that, we found that your EV customers are very different to your traditional car customers. They are high net worth individuals, and they've already invested in sustainable living in South Africa. And they're predominantly unaffected by load shedding. I think added to this is electric vehicles is also a second to third household in a vehicle. So we do foresee great opportunity for the launch of Aura in South Africa. And I think we're glad to be pioneering EV vehicles, or be a contributor of pioneering EV vehicles in South Africa.
Now, GWM already has a 16-year history in the South African market. So how has the company contributed to local industrialization and employment? Could you elaborate on the standout moments from collaborating with local partners?
It's a very good question. I think just to keep in mind, GWM have only taken over distributions in South Africa again in the last 6 years. So we're relatively new as a jointly Chinese-owned organization in South Africa. We've been fortunate that our products have been massively successful in South Africa, and we've increased our dealer network by 25% just last year alone. So we've created significant job opportunities in the retail space. I think the next opportunity for us is to utilize the local policies within national, provincial, and local government and seek further opportunities that can create the assembly of vehicles or even the manufacturing of components in South Africa and strengthen that relationship between China, but also not only South Africa and China, but the greater African continent.
All right, thank you so much for your insights, Conrad David Greenwald, COO of GWM Havel, South Africa. South Africa's Minister of Electricity, Romo Gopa, held discussions with officials from State Grid, China's largest electricity company, regarding potential collaboration between the two countries in the field of electricity during this year's BRICS summit. China had previously constructed South Africa's largest wind farm in 2017. In June this year, South African officials visited China to assess solar equipment. To understand more on how China can help South Africa address its energy challenges, our Chen Mengfei spoke to Hartmut Winkler, a physics professor and an energy sector expert based in Johannesburg.
At the moment, people would be roughly 2 to 4 hours without electricity, but this has been going on for the whole year. It means that houses just simply don't have light or aren't able to cook or to heat in winter, which is a problem. But and it just costs the economy a lot. So the question is now, what does one do? Does one continue running the coal plants, which is what some people are saying? And there again, one can do what China's done particularly well over the last couple of years is to install solar power and wind power on a really huge scale. That is what I think that South Africa should also do.
How much do you think the collaboration with China will help South Africa solve its energy crisis?
I think it would do a lot. Right now, I don't see any other country building, or at least in the medium term, building the sort of number of solar panels and associated components to what China's producing right now. So any kind of progress in terms of renewable energy is going to rely a lot on Chinese companies. Earlier this year, we had a great demand for installation of solar panels, and there just simply weren't enough to go around. I know people had to wait for 1 or 2 months until finally they could get a delivery of such solar panels. I think one of the things that our minister was hoping to achieve is to somehow increase not so much the production, I guess one can't do much about that, but the actual deliveries that would then supply solar panels here. Because at the moment, I think if one was to double the amount that is currently being imported, I think there would be people that would purchase that.
Your solar panel, the one you have on your roof, is that made in China?
Yes, even though it's called Canadian, but it's made in China.
And how does it work?
Oh, beautifully. Yeah, very nicely.
Okay.
I haven't had any power outages since I installed it.
Now let's examine how the BRICS nations are enhancing trade and investment relationships, both internally and outside the coalition, and also how they are playing a role in the global economic recovery.
Amidst prevailing challenges of unilateralism, trade protectionism, and economic nationalism impacting global trade, the BRICS nations stand out as a beacon of positivity. Recent data released by China's Customs Authority reveals that the country's trade with fellow BRICS members has surged beyond $550 billion, marking an impressive increase of nearly 13% compared to the same period in the previous year. Moreover, these already strong economic ties are poised to grow even stronger. On August 8th, Minister of Trade and Economy from BRICS collectively decided to fortify the WTO-centered multilateral trading system. They also committed to deepening collaboration in realms such as digital economy and environmentally sustainable development. Furthermore, they pledged to bolster global supply chains and extend their cooperative efforts to encompass other developing countries, including the least developed ones. These initiatives are primed to reinforce the global multilateral trading framework and facilitate the broader resurgence of the worldwide economy.
This year's BRICS Summit is highlighting the synergy between the organization and many African countries. Earlier, our reporter Sun Ye spoke with Dennis Denya, Vice President of the African Export-Import Bank, on how China can play an important role in the African continental free trade area.
You were talking about inter-Africa growth, and China could be playing a role in that. What are the areas are you referring?
And there are a number of areas where we can cooperate mutually to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. One area where China has really excelled is in terms of education and skills development. In order for us to take advantage of the AFCTA agreement, we need skills that are essential for the fourth industrial revolution. And China has made tremendous progress in terms of technological advancement, skills development. And I believe this is an area where Africa and China can really cooperate, resulting in a mutually beneficial outcome to the infrastructure gaps that exist across the continent. Whether we're talking about transportation, whether we're talking about health, and China has really made tremendous progress in terms of implementing large-scale projects. We need Africa to connect. All the countries need to have adequate connectivity in order to make the AFCTA a success. I'm talking here about roads infrastructure, rail infrastructure, ports infrastructure, and the experience that China has gained will be beneficial to the African continent. And that's a huge area of opportunity for Africa to gain from the experience of China. It's not only there. You are aware Africa is home to 60% of the world arable land, and yet the productivity levels on the continent are the lowest among any region. And if you look at the progress China has made in terms of not only agricultural production, but agribusiness. And this is a low-hanging fruit. Africa can really benefit from that engagement. And China will also benefit from cooperating with African countries in terms of agriculture and agribusiness as well.
How can the African continent benefit from working with the BRICS?
It will help them grow in a number of ways. One is in terms of access to technology. It's also capacity building. It helps them access to a bigger market. You know, the BRICS are a South-South organization. We share a common history. We share a common pathway to economic development. So having a larger grouping of like-minded countries is going to be very beneficial to Africa.
The new development bank has successfully launched its inaugural rand-denominated bond in the global market. This marks the bank's initial issuance of a local currency bond within South Africa, and it garnered an overwhelming response, being oversubscribed. The NDB received bids exceeding 2.5 billion rand, or about $79 million. Our Sumitra Naidu has more.
It was no surprise that the first ZAR bond auction attracted plenty of interest as over 40 countries clamored to join the BRICS grouping.
Investor sentiment is driven by the geopolitical environment. If we see what is happening in the world and how the multilateral system has actually, in a way, failed the global south, then you can imagine that there's a lot of interest in BRICS, and that is why we see those amounts of countries wanting to join BRICS. And I think that sentiment then also spills over in terms of interest in what the new development bank is doing and other assets apart from those ones that are only seen as your typical US dollar issuers.
The bank auctioned off 2 bonds, a 5-year note at 1 billion rand and a 500 million rand 3-year note. The overwhelming support gave the bank an opportunity to up its trade to 1.5 billion rand. Over 70% was taken out by international investors, with the rest by local banks.
it's very exciting, but I think what I like most is now they've put away, let's say, 3- and 5-year debt. That debt can now be issued to South Africa for project funding in rands. And the big thing then, you don't run all this US dollar currency risk, because if you borrow in US dollars and you've got to pay 5% or whatever on that, and the rand goes from 16 to 19 to the dollar, it really causes pain. If you can denominate it in rands, that's great. Second prize is probably to denominate it in a currency that's more linked to your currency.
This is the first bond auction to be held under the BRICS Bank and will no doubt be celebrated at the 15th BRICS Summit here in South Africa. The new development bank was established back in 2014 to raise financing for infrastructure and sustainable development and really become an alternative lending institution for other emerging markets. Samitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
And that's it from me on the current trade and investment relations between China and Africa and how the BRICS Summit can further strengthen bilateral ties in the economic front. Back to you for now, Pendo.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We continue our special live coverage on the BRICS Summit. A business forum has been held on the sidelines of the event, with leaders calling for more cooperation. Chinese President Xi Jinping called for actions to enhance solidarity and cooperation, to overcome risks and challenges, and to jointly build a better world. So Ye reports from Johannesburg.
In our country,
South Africa's president wasted little time railing against protectionism and unilateralism.
However, the new wave of protectionism and subsequent impact of unilateral measures that are incompatible with WTO rules undermine the global economic growth and development. We therefore need to reaffirm our position that economic growth must be underpinned by transparency, by inclusiveness. It must be compatible with a multilateral trading system that supports a developmental agenda.
China's Minister of Commerce read remarks on behalf of Chinese President Xi Jinping. In the statement, Xi repeatedly called for more cooperation, including advancing expansion of BRICS membership.
Whatever resistance there may be, BRICS, a positive and stable force for good, will continue to grow. We will forge stronger BRICS strategic partnership, expand the BRICS Plus model, actively advance membership expansion, deepen solidarity and cooperation with other EMDCs, promote global multipolarity and greater democracy in international relations, and help make the international order more just and equitable.
The Chinese comments were met several times with applause.
We are in BRICS not by accident, because we have hope, we have desires, we hope that BRICS will grow.
I welcome very much the Chinese declaration, the declaration of President of China, and because it encourages everybody to start and to join to make a different world.
The summit's main session takes place Wednesday, when leaders will continue to discuss possible BRICS expansion. CGTN, Johannesburg.
Well, gentlemen, let's talk about BRICS economic growth and its potential. We just heard from the South African president calling for transparency and multilateralism in future economic growth and efforts related to this bit. So talking about 5 BRICS members, gentlemen, help us walk through the common but differentiated driving forces of the 5 member countries, Professor.
Well, first of all, if we look at the 5 BRICS members, 3 of them, that's Russia, China, and India, are contiguous with each other. They form continuously a big landmass stretching from the Arctic all the way to the Indian Ocean. Now, Brazil and South Africa each is located in the southern part of South America, as well as southern part of Africa itself. So these 5 countries are very strategically located, geographically speaking. But now I think there is a big push to expand the membership. I understand there are about 40 countries either having expressed interest or having formally submitted letters of submissions, applications to become new members. This means that the BRICS organization really has a lot of attractiveness for the other countries in the world, and it really bodes well for its development. It really stands for the future of the world, and in terms of its weighting in global economy, for example, as well as its representativeness of the global south. And also, if you look at each of these member states, currently 5, each has its own advantages. As Anand said, huge resources for Russia, and great political, economic advantages for South Africa as well as for Brazil, and India and China being the 2 largest populations in the world. If we can close rank and overcome whatever challenges there are, and overcome internal problems, for example, territorial disputes between China and India, then I think the BRICS organization, as composed of the 5 members now, can really generate a much greater effectiveness and efficiency. Now, by attracting more members into BRICS, especially countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, for example, 2 of the richest oil and gas producers in the world, it will make the membership of BRICS much more solid, and will make whatever they decide to do going forward in the coming years much more impactful to the international community. BRICS does not want to challenge anyone. BRICS just want to make sure that whatever they stand for will be promoting equality and equal treatment among countries in the world. We refuse to succumb to a world order which is dominated by one single country, which claims to be the unipole of the world. The world today is multilateralism, and I think BRICS is a shining example of how multilateralism is, and how it can evolve, and how it can serve as a magnet to attract more countries to join.
Now, if we're talking about a possible expansion of the BRICS, Mr. Tang, does that necessarily mean the 5 current members have to share or distribute their economic growth momentums or experiences evenly to possible new members, or do you think a new or updated platform is needed?
Well, I mean, they're going to have to change how they do things. The more members you have in something, the more difficult it is to reach consensus. And remember, this is a consensus body. This is not, well, 3 countries said yes, 2 said no. It's not like the Security Council where one country can say, well, I don't like this, so it's not going to happen. So they have to be very careful about how they bring in countries. And this is what I've been stressing. These are middle powers. They're not advanced nations, so they don't have the wealth of the G7. So they can't just give money away. They all have issues. In Brazil, obviously, they're trying to industrialize. They have unemployment issues. They have development issues. Russia, particular issues, especially given security and where they're going to go in future to the markets. China has its own issues. It's developing, but right now with global demand going down, it's very, very difficult. They're having to switch the way that they develop in terms of going more towards internal markets, trying to attract investment in India, somewhere in between. Not clear exactly how they intend to develop. They want to industrialize, but it hasn't been successful. And this is one of the issues. I mean, we all talk about everyone, the golden thing is industrialization. Who's going to buy all this stuff, right? If everybody was to industrialize right now at the same point, all you would have is prices plummeting and those same businesses going out of business because they can't supply at the lowest price. So there has to be a better framework when you start looking at this. And I think South Africa was bringing this forward. He was really lamenting when he talked about this idea of deglobalization. It has to be transparent, and it can't be against organizations like the World Trade Organization. Now, who's holding that up right now? The United States refuses to allow any appellate judges to be seated. Why is that important? There can be no final ruling of the WTO that can stick unless there is a final appellate judge, assuming somebody wants to appeal, and generally they will if they're losing. So, you know, right now they're saying these countries are crying for a world order, something they can depend on, something they can start saying, okay, this is the landscape. Let's be very practical. What do we have to offer? How do we develop it? All right? How can other countries help us? I mean, this RAND bond that they were talking about, extremely important, because what it does is it takes away the additional risk of dealing in dollars. And dollars right now have not been this, you know, wonderful, safe place. I mean, it's going up and down depending on the rates and the whims of the U.S. Fed. You know, Africa, you know, sits there and they say, why are our lives being ruined by the actions of somebody we don't know, thousands of miles away, who's concerned only about themselves, right? The Fed does not care. When a Fed governor was asked about, do you worry about the impact of what you're doing on places like Africa, South America? His answer was, well, you know, in the broad scheme of things, what's good for America eventually is good for the world. This is no longer an answer. So yes, they are looking for a better framework, one that is inclusive and one allows them to grow.
Now, since you mentioned this rand-denominated bond, let's talk a little bit more on the role of the new development bank. Would you say it's kind of a financial institution of the BRICS, or do you think it's kind of an experiment or joint effort to explore more opportunities for the larger global south? Because since we're talking about currencies, the safety of investment, flow of capital, and of course the currencies, let me refer you to the remarks from Dilma Rousseff, the current president of the new development bank. She said on Tuesday that local currencies are not alternatives to US dollar. Local currencies are alternatives to a system. What's your reading into this?
Okay, so US dollars are there, and they're not going to be replaced anytime soon. You can talk about a BRICS currency, but the apparatus, the structure to do it, the physical structure of making sure that you can on a daily basis close tens, if not hundreds of millions of transactions, all right, that has to be very secure, and you have to set up that infrastructure. Currently it's done through the U.S. system, the SWIFT system, which is just a conglomeration. They literally just do all the transactions and make sure and certify them. So there are structural issues, and as was said and acknowledged, that, you know, there is no quick fix to this. But when you start talking about the dollar as a value by which you measure currencies, that is different from the system. Right now, what you see with the RAND, all right, what you see with dim sum bonds, currency swaps, countries are trying to de-risk, and this is the proper use of de-risk.
Right.
De-risking, right. Otherwise I never understand.
So you're not a big fan of the very term de-dollarization, but you would rather use the very word de-risk, the correct use of it.
Yeah, well no, de-dollarization is happening in the background because people are concerned about it. The de-risking is what's driving it. People do not want to be subject to the whims of another country. They just say, look, it's hard enough to develop when we're forced to take out money in dollar-denominated bonds, and then we'd have no control of what's going to happen, and only we know is that it'll be for the benefit of the U.S. It doesn't matter what happens to us. Then people start to say, we need another way, and this is what Rousseff is talking about. It's also what these RAND bonds and future bonds will be, because I guarantee you, this was successful, it will continue again.
Well, good to know. Let's see if that will be the case in the near future. What's your take on this, Professor Gao?
Well,
the new development bank, its role?
Yes, the new development bank is a very important bank headed by the former president of Brazil, who is very, very active when she's, heading the bank headquartered in Shanghai. Now, allow me to say one thing about the de-dollarization. If there is de-dollarization, I think the culprit is not any other country but Washington itself, because the act of high irresponsibility of printing money as if there will be no tomorrow highly dilutes the real value of the dollar, and it's an act of after me the deluge. Basically, they don't care about the impact on any other country, and almost all the other countries hold dollars one way or another. They don't care about the impact on their value, and eventually, other things being equal, paper money eventually ends up with a zero value. It's just a matter of time. So what Washington is doing is accelerating the process of depreciation of the dollar eventually to hollowing out the real value of the dollar. This is highly irresponsible. It raises alarm in many capitals in the world, and this is the reason why there is an urgent need to figure out a better way, not to replace the dollar, but at least to make sure that the dollar dominance is not that dominant. And if this is not handled properly, this will be probably one of the last nails in the coffin of the United States hegemony. So I think decision makers in Washington really need to be fully aware of what they are doing, and they should never practice acts like this of high irresponsibility as if there will be no consequences. There will be consequences, and if more and more countries really demand settling the international trade with their own currencies, for example, or with other forms of currencies, or with digital currency eventually, then I think it will be really making the future of the United States much gloomier than it is today. So I call on decision makers in Washington to wake up and to abandon such acts of high irresponsibility and really gain their conscience. When they are the #1 country in the world, when the US dollar is still the dominant dollar of reserve or settlement or whatever, they should not abuse their position. They should care for their position, and they should also care for the fundamental interest of all the other countries, all the other stakeholders in this dollar dominated international currency system. Otherwise, I think tomorrow for the United States will be much worse than it is today.
What about investment among BRICS countries? For example, we just heard earlier, we heard my colleague Michelle talking to South African executive of GWM have a very outstanding Chinese automaker. Would you say that is kind of an example of mutually beneficial investment among members?
Absolutely. I would say the 5 BRICS members as they are today are highly different, and they have advantages and disadvantages, weaknesses and strengths. Now, for the BRICS framework, I have several personal ideas. One is to build up a concentric circle of things involving all the 5 member states so that they can, on certain things of their own selection, move in greater tandem going forward. For example, we talked about the idea of a collective currency involving the 5 BRICS countries. It's very difficult. It may take a lot of time to push through for a major breakthrough, for example, or for example in terms of energy cooperation, because Russia is rich in oil and gas, and both China and India really need to have a long-term recipe for energy sustainability and security, for example, and Brazil, China in particular, and India to a lesser extent have manufacturing muscles to it, and India wants to further increase that. How they can coordinate with each other, for example, how they can really give play to their strengths and downplay their disadvantages, for example. And then in terms of financial cooperation, let me use one example. China is pushing for this Union Pay system, and it is very successful in countries like South Africa, Brazil, etc. Whether eventually we should have a Brazil Pay.
Well, gentlemen, as we're talking about this, the leaders of 5 BRICS member countries are now taking a group photo together in Johannesburg. You're watching live footage from the South African city where this year's BRICS summit is happening right now. You can see 5 leaders are holding hands, showing solidarity, at least at this occasion, taking a group photo together. So, this is live footage from Johannesburg. So, Professor Gao, you were talking about a coordinated, highly coordinated system.
Absolutely. For example, for Union Pay, which is very successful in South Africa, in Brazil, etc., why couldn't we think about introducing a rebranding? For example, in Brazil, it's called Brazil Pay, which is a member of the Union Pay family. In South Africa, it will be South Africa Pay, which is a member of the Union Pay family. But with these national local brands, I think it will be an incentive for government entities, corporates, people, etc., to more and more enjoy using the conveniences provided by Union Pay. Now, if we have a more concerted efforts to promote such concerted efforts involving all the 5 BRICS countries, it will be pushing through a higher level of sophistication. Universities, for example, I understand the 5 BRICS countries have come up with a new ranking system of how to rank qualities of universities. How about more concerted efforts going forward involving...
Now, interestingly, you mentioned this new ranking system. Earlier, we've been hearing those rankings from the United States and the UK, for example, the Times 100 and QS 100, things like that. Why these 5 countries need new rankings on their own universities?
Well, first of all, the current ranking system may or may not be very prejudicial and may not actually reflect the realities on the ground. Now, for the 5 BRICS countries, each put a premium on education, higher education in particular, and they want to make sure that their universities are not left out in the cold, and there will be more accurate, more pragmatic criteria set up to rank universities across the board, including in the developed countries as well as in the global south, in particular among the 5 BRICS members, and going forward, more countries may join the BRIC organization. Now, such ranking system, unique to the 5 BRICS countries, will be an important instrument going forward, and not only in terms of college ranking. I think there can be many other things in terms of standardization, new initiatives, for example, and also now that the United States is pushing for the separation of technologies, standards, for example, why couldn't we, among the 5 BRICS countries to start with standardizations for the BRICS countries, which may eventually be of global application. So I think the sky is the limit.
Right. What's your take on this, Mr. Tangen? Professor Gao just proposed a highly concerted and coordinated future system for the BRICS, but we have to talk about realistic challenges, outside interferences, and the rising uncertainties in the world. What's your take on this?
Okay, so a couple of questions there.
Right.
All right, I really like Victor's idea, and I think what you have to realize is that when you put out a survey, it's based on the values that you think are there. So for instance, how many people in China have made a decision about where to send their child in the US based on US News and World Report list without any idea how that list is put together? It's not put together in the satisfaction of the students and how well they've done and what they've done. It's based heavily on how much research funds they get. Where the research funds come? From the US government. So by having your own ranking system, you're now bringing together 5 countries, and if they can agree on this, they're going to have different civilizational values. They're going to say, look, what we really want to do is we want to measure the performance of these kids as 5 years out. That's very important. We want to see substantively what they give back to society and things like this. So it represents a difference. But it's not only this kind of ranking that's important, because once you have that ranking, then people believe it, all right? Then you have a sense of your own character, and you can explain to people what values you're basing on. Civilization. We see so much about all of these different surveys about trust and things like that, but they're always somehow weighted averages dependent on who puts the survey together. I think it would be very good to have a global south. Remember, 160 countries, all right?
That's the majority of the
exactly
members in this international community.
But they have no say in the rankings that discuss them. So this is a great opportunity. Why? Because it brings together countries, and they have to suddenly look at what are their common civilization values. What are the values of their societies that they can share, they can enunciate, and then put into a value statement, which is what a survey is, right? So that's sort of important. Now let's look at headwinds. You asked about that. Okay, so you take 160 countries. Let's look at those countries. They control the world's resources. You're talking about South Africa, Africa, South America, all right, ASEAN, Middle East, Central Asia. Guess what? The 40 other countries, they may be very advanced, but places like Europe don't have those resources. They need them. If the global South were to come together and start saying, we're no longer like OPEC, going to sell you resources at below value prices. We have to extract some value from this. This is not a conduit of our value going to you so you can make money. So if they started putting together these consortiums, there would be a lot of consternation. And I can guarantee you they're already gaming this out in Washington, D.C. and not happy about it. One thing in the U.S. that we do not like is any competitive threat to our supremacy. And this would be a massive threat. So yeah, there are issues out there in terms of ideology, obviously American exceptionalism, this belief that there can be only one type of economic and political system and that every country has to follow that. That is going to continue to be an issue. But you know, in terms of pragmatics, I agree with Victor. There are a lot of things out there that could be solved by countries coming together and understanding their values. China does not have a good understanding of the 120 countries where it is the primary economic partner, trade partner. And those countries do not have an understanding of China. Before today, it was very simple. 20 years ago, you needed to know about your country, maybe a few of your neighbors, and then the United States. Why? Because the United States was everything, right? You just had to know how to speak English and make contracts and things like that. Today, with a multipolar world, the reality is every country needs to know every other country that it's dealing with. And I think that's a great opportunity. Less chance for miscommunication if you actually understand each other.
What's your take on this, Professor Gao? This is an opportunity, but this may also be the biggest challenge because of this us and them mentality from some US political elites, as Mr. Tangen just mentioned. Of course, we'd like to talk about economic development, the future prospects, but it's impossible to talk about them without talking about the political side of this context. What do you think is the biggest challenge for BRICS in the future, politically speaking?
Yeah, well, let me give you two examples. Sometimes I'm really shocked to hear some country say they represent the international community. The reality is that they don't. Now, from China's perspective, if any other country says it represents the international community without involving China's voice or without consulting China, it's ludicrous, is that right? Now, with BRICS as a group and the BRICS membership to be expanded, I hope those countries will realize the futility of claiming that they represent the international community if they do not include the voices from the BRICS countries, because we represent up to about 40% or 50% of the global population, and the percentage will be further increased with new members coming in. And those countries, especially one or two countries, will realize the futility of claiming that they represent the international community. Now, the other thing is also important. I hear more and more some countries claim that value-based. Now, whose value? It is your value? Is your value universal value? Does your value represent my value, for example? Do you have higher value? I have lower value? You need to be more clearly defined. Therefore, I would say going forward, those countries who keep putting values on top of their mouth, if they do not consider or care about our values, that value is not universal value. Don't fool yourself, don't fool the rest of the world. You need to talk about the values of the BRICS countries, for example, China, Brazil, India and South Africa and Russia, and increasingly more countries, for example. So I believe with this BRICS framework, more and more being activated, for example, people in the world, 8 billion of them, will see truth as it is and will see falsehood as it is, will not be confused by some allegations or false proclamations that they represent the values of mankind or they represent the future of the world, or they represent the international community. No, it will never be the case anymore.
Right, gentlemen, let's go to Johannesburg and get the latest from the ongoing BRICS summit in that South African city. Leaders have just held a closed-door meeting and taken a family photo for the BRICS summit. And now for more on that, let's cross live to our correspondent Daniel Arabmoy in Johannesburg. Daniel, you've been following this very closely. Bring us up to date.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, just like you've mentioned, the leaders have had a closed session this morning. But of course, we understand exactly what you're talking about, given the fact that we have this at hand. And one of the key areas that the issues, areas that the leaders have been discussing this morning is the question of realizing the full potential of BRICS for inclusive global economic recovery and sustainable development. Now, the background to this discussion is the fact that many of the members of the bloc really took a beating during the COVID-19 pandemic that hit hard many of these countries. Now, including, of course, the skyrocketing fuel prices, skyrocketing food prices that affected many of these countries. Now, the BRICS members have been discussing ways of how to make sure that history does not repeat itself. They're trying to find ways of how they can prevent such occurrences in the near future. And secondly, of course, they've also been discussing issues to do with strengthening mutually beneficial partnership with Africa and the global south in a multipolar world, which has of course been exacerbated by the Ukraine conflict. How do they as leaders then come together with one voice to make sure that they solve international political or security challenges that face the member states together with one voice as a bloc? And the leaders have also been discussing questions to do with the deepening and strengthening progressive multilateralism and delivering a global south in a multipolar world. Now, we do remember that yesterday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa did mention or raise a concern about protectionism that has affected the development of the global world. They want to see that this is changed, and that's the discussion that has been going on. And of course, later on, we'll be able to get exactly the outcome of this. If not today, then the press conference that will happen tomorrow will tell us exactly what they concluded. And finally, one of the key questions that many have not spoken about is the question of strengthening the power of the women. Now, yesterday, Ramaphosa did mention that there is need for financial institutions to put more money into businesses that are run by women, to give them that power, to promote them so that they participate fully in the economic development of the BRICS bloc.
Thank you very much, our correspondent Daniel Arabmoy in Johannesburg. Now, gentlemen, let's continue our discussion on the BRICS summit this year. As we discussed briefly earlier, the BRICS expansion is a hot topic this year, but we're not speculating any results at this moment. But we remember that BRICS has been emphasizing that it's not trying to replace any existing mechanisms or groupings like G7 or G20. And I'd like to go back to your earlier notion that, Professor Gao, we have to talk about the value of the BRICS now. What is the BRICS value? If they're not going to replace any existing mechanisms, then what's the value it's upholding?
I believe the BRICS value should represent several things. One is that we need to maintain domestic stability, which is indispensable for domestic economic development and improving the living standards of the people. Secondly, we need to maintain global peace. Global peace doesn't mean that we can prevent any outbreak of war anywhere in the world, but at least we need to commit ourselves to promoting peace rather than picking war as an instrument of politics. Now, on these two bases, I think we also need to make sure that the development that BRICS countries need to promote will be inclusive development, meaning for all walks of life in our societies, but also inclusive development for BRICS members as well as non-BRICS members in the global south. Because otherwise, you will constantly live in an unequal world. And this is exactly one problem for the current international order, because you have a very small minority of countries monopolizing opportunities and also monopolizing many other privileges, which actually they inherit from colonial past. So the root of these privileges actually are tainted in blood, and people in the countries which have achieved the national independence, for example, are tied up of this kind of bad legacy in the history of the world. We want to be equal. We want to provide equal access, equal opportunities for countries everywhere in the world, rather than having a very small minority of the countries monopolizing all these privileges, for example. That means the international world order need to be more equal, and BRICS want to make a major push in that direction. Multilateralism should be fully recognized by everyone. No country should be allowed to indulge in fantasy that it is the unipole of the world, or it is better than anyone else, or, for example, it can use war as an instrument to achieve its goal. Now, with these major values, I would say, for BRICS organization, I truly believe the world of tomorrow will be a better world.
Right, indeed. And as we're speaking, the BRICS Summit this year is ongoing in Johannesburg, the South African city. And South Africa is the host nation this year. And it says that over 40 countries have expressed interest in joining the bloc. And earlier, Professor called this the attractiveness of the grouping. Now let's cross live to Johannesburg, where the leaders are speaking.
Your Excellency, President Vladimir Putin, Your Excellency Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Your Excellency President Xi Jinping, Your Excellency Deputy President Paul Mashatile, Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, Your Excellency Dilma Rousseff, President of the New Development Bank, Chair of the BRICS Business Council, Ms. Busi Mabuza, Chair of the BRICS Women's Business Alliance, Ms. Lebogang Zulu, honorable ministers and all guests here present, members of the diplomatic corps who are here with us, I'd like to welcome you all to South Africa and to the 15th BRICS Summit. This is the open session of our summit, so it's a pleasure and a joy to have all of you here. The BRICS partnership straddles 4 continents and 5 countries that are home to almost 3.5 billion people who live on this planet. Over the past decades, the bloc has been a major driver of global growth, of global trade and investment as well. BRICS stands for solidarity and for progress. BRICS stands for inclusivity and for a more equitable order. BRICS also stands for sustainable development. We are an inclusive formation of developing and emerging economies that are seeking to work together to benefit from our rich histories, our rich cultures, and systems to advance the prosperity of the peoples of our countries. We do so because we know that poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment are the biggest challenges facing humanity. We are therefore determined that the BRICS partnership, which has been growing in importance and influence over the years, must be harnessed to drive an inclusive global economic recovery. Advancing the African agenda for us is a strategic priority as South Africa during its chairship of BRICS. It is for this reason that we have chosen as the theme for this year's summit, BRICS and Africa, a partnership for mutually accelerated growth, sustainability, and inclusive multilateralism. We welcome the ongoing engagement of BRICS countries with Africa in the spirit of partnership and mutual respect. We are pleased that all BRICS members, Brazil is re-engaging with the African continent in a meaningful way. Russia has always had really good and meaningful relations with African countries. China has chosen to assist and support Africa with its aspirations for development. And all of us, in the ways that we are involved and engaged, we want to be engaged with Africa. India continues to increase its engagement and its trade with Africa. So as the BRICS family, all of us as members, we are deeply invested, deeply engaged with Africa. Our objectives are reciprocal trade and investment. We want the goods and products and services from Africa to compete on an equal footing on the global economy. The African Continental Free Trade Area, once fully operational, will unlock the benefits of the continental market and generate mutually beneficial opportunities for both African and BRICS countries. As nations of the world confront the effects of climate change, we must ensure that the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future is just, it must be fair, and it must be able to take into account the different circumstances that prevail in all countries. In line with this objective, BRICS nations need to advance the interests of the Global South and call for industrialized countries to honor their commitments to support climate actions by developing economic progress. The commitments of support that have been made that have not yet been lived up to need to be followed through. Peace and stability are preconditions for a better, more equitable world. We are deeply concerned about conflicts across the world that continue to cause a great deal of suffering and hardship to many people around the world. As South Africa, our position remains that diplomacy, dialogue, negotiation, and adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter are necessary for the peaceful and just resolution of conflicts. We are concerned that global financial and payment systems are increasingly being used as instruments of geopolitical contestation. Global economic recovery relies on predictable global payment systems and the smooth operating of banking, supply chains, trade, tourism, as well as financial flows. We will continue discussions on practical measures to facilitate trade and investment flows through the increased use of local currencies. This is a matter we believe that further discussions need to take place, particularly amongst our finance ministers. The world is changing. New economic, political, social, and technological realities for greater cooperation between nations is essential. New realities call for a fundamental reform of the institutions of global governance so that they may be more representative and better able to respond to the challenges that confront humanity. While many believe that we should advance the interests of all people, we believe that, yes, as we advance them, the interests of the global South, that we as BRICS want to be ready to advance are essential, and in this regard, we want to collaborate more, to cooperate more with all countries that aspire to create a more inclusive international order. We are confident that this 15th BRICS Summit will advance the cause of common prosperity and progress. We are confident that this 15th BRICS Summit will in the end enrich and inspire our work towards the achievement of a much more humane global community. This is what BRICS is all about. This is what BRICS is committed to achieving. It is a great honor for us as South Africa to have this opportunity to host this 15th BRICS Summit and to have in our presence the BRICS members as they are represented here. And with those words, I open this session and then call upon one of the young leaders of our country who is also going to have an opportunity to give the words of welcome, but also to give the hope that young people in the BRICS countries hope to communicate to all of us. I call upon Ms. Asanda Luwaka to speak to us. She is the chairperson of the Board of Directors of the National Youth Development Agency that seeks to advance the interests of young people in South Africa. Ms. Ayanda.
Thank you very much, Honorable President. Your Excellencies and the heads of states of the BRICS countries, ministers and deputy ministers present, members of the media, leaders of business, civil society and labor, young people. It gives me great pleasure to deliver a statement on behalf of young people to the BRICS Heads of State Summit. Young people make up a large proportion of the populations of each of our respective countries. Their voices and views are critical as we forge a post-pandemic society at the highest decision-making forums. I must recognize the efforts of the organizers in ensuring that young people are represented at this particular summit. Your Excellencies, from the 18th till the 20th of July, young people from BRICS countries converged in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal for the 9th BRICS Youth Summit and the first in person since the pandemic. The summit was convened under the theme, BRICS and Africa, Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism, to discuss the current state and future prospects for the development of youth cooperation in BRICS countries over a wide range of areas. As we have entered into the decade of action of the Sustainable Development Goals, we believe that BRICS countries in general, and young people in particular, should use their collective strengths to prioritize the development paradigm, using it as a guiding principle for our work as we continue intra-BRICS cooperation across areas such as trade, education, skills development and training, economic participation and transformation, health and well-being, and social cohesion. Your Excellencies, young people in their collective believe that youth are the present and the future, and our interactions as BRICS member states cannot and should not be limited to an annual summit. which is why at our 9th Youth Summit, we presented the draft framework for the establishment of a BRICS Youth Council, which will become the coordinating body for youth development between BRICS member countries and will join formations such as the BRICS Business Council, BRICS Women's Alliance, and the New Development Bank. More importantly, the Youth Council will be a historic achievement for young people across our BRICS member states. Since the summit, leaders of youth agencies have met on 3 occasions to consider the draft declaration and framework of the BRICS Youth Council, and we are pleased to inform this summit that we have reached consensus on the establishment of a Youth Council. This will allow us to ensure deeper and stronger collaboration amongst young people. We thus implore that this summit endorse our proposal for the establishment of the BRICS Youth Council in its final declaration, in ensuring that new pathways for positive change and innovation can be realized, and in doing so, will further ensure that no young person amongst the BRICS member states gets left behind. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayanda Luaka, for bringing the youth voice in the BRICS Summit. Your proposals indeed are very clear and comprehensive, and we will be responding to that. It now gives me pleasure to ask His Excellency President Luis Lula da Silva, President of the Federative Republic of Brazil, to take the floor.
My dear President of the Republic of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, my dear President Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, here represented by Foreign Affairs Minister Lavrov, my dear Prime Minister Modi of India, my dear Xi Jinping, President of the People's Republic of China, and my dear sister Dilma Rousseff, the CEO of the New Development Bank, State Ministers of Brazil that are in my delegation, Mauro Vieira of Foreign Affairs, Fernando Haddad, Finance Minister of Brazil, Aniele Franco for Racial Equality, Ambassador Celso Amorim, Special International Advisor of the President, and my dear wife, Janja. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Business Forum of the BRICS, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Women's Entrepreneurial Alliance, and Madam Limbo Zulu, representative of the Business Alliance of Women of BRICS, and the youth member, Asanda Luaka. Dear friends, it's with great joy to come back to Johannesburg, the city that was a very important stage of struggle against apartheid and that continues to inspire us to fight all forms of discrimination and inequality. The last time that I participated in this summit meeting, 2010, I had the honor to host in Brasilia, our capital, the heads of state and government of Russia, India, and China, besides South Africa, that participated as a candidate to become member of the BRICS. Only 1 year after that meeting, we confirmed that South Africa would join the BRICS in the first expansion of our grouping. Its inclusion made that we could better reflect the new confederation of the world power. We left that meeting strengthened. Today, we represent 41% of the world population, and we are responsible for 31% of the global GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. But we face a more complex scenario than when we met for the very first time. In few years, we went back from a benign multipolarity juncture to going back to an absolute mindset of Cold War and geopolitical competition. This is lack of the senses that generates great uncertainty and corrodes multilateralism. We know very well this path could take us. The world needs to understand the risks that are involved and which are unacceptable for humanity. The BRICS, we should say that all suffer the consequences of the war. The most vulnerable population in the developing countries are the ones that are hit more in an unproportional way. The Ukraine war shows the limitations of the UN Security Council. Many other conflicts and crises do not have the same attention, and the BRICS is a forum to discuss the main issues that affect peace and world security. We cannot bypass the treat. The main conflict of today that is happening in Ukraine that has global effects. Brazil has an historical position in the defense of the sovereignty and integrity of the territory and of all the principles that are followed by the UN. We believe that it is positive that a growing number of countries, amongst them the BRICS countries, also are engaged in direct contact with Moscow and with Kiev. We do not underestimate the difficulties to reach peace, and either we can be indifferent to the deaths and the destruction that increase every day. Brazil does not contemplate unilateral formulas for peace. We are ready to join efforts that we can effectively contribute for immediate ceasefire and a fair and everlasting peace. Everybody suffers with the consequences of the war. The most vulnerable population in the developing countries are the ones that are reached in an unproportional way. The Ukraine war shows the limitations of the UN Security Council. Many other conflicts and crises do not receive the due attention, even causing vast suffering for their peoples. Haitians, Yemenites, Syrians, Libyans, and Sudanese, and Palestinians all deserve to live in peace. It is unacceptable that global military spending in 1 year goes beyond $2 trillion, while the FAO says to us that 735 million people are in hunger every day in the world. The quest for peace is a collective obligation and an imperative for a fair development and sustainable development. The BRICS should act as a force for understanding and for cooperation. Our willingness is expressed in the contributions given by China, South Africa, and from my own country in all the endeavors to conflict resolution in Ukraine. There are many places while men go to war, the women are the ones that fight for conciliation. The valuation and the strengthening of the role of women in the resolution of conflicts will be more and more central for peace in the world. And more than that, the women's empowerment is a precondition for a full socioeconomic development. And paraphrasing Thomas Sankara, a great Pan-African leader, which says, we cannot hope for a society where half of the population is silenced by male chauvinism and by discrimination in political participation and in the world of labor. Dear friends, the weakening of the global governance is also clear in the development agendas, in financing, and in the confrontation with climate change. When I came back to the presidency in Brazil, I was very sad to see that the implementation of the 2030 agenda is under risk in all the world. A recent report from the UN indicates that we're in a strong backwardness. We see the greatest increase of inequality between the countries in more than the last 3 decades. In 30% of the goals, we stagnated or we're going backwards. It's very difficult to fight climate change while many developing countries still have to deal with hunger, poverty, and other kinds of violence. The principle of common and shared responsibility, but differentiated, is something that is true till today. The major response for the carbon emissions that cause the climate change were those countries that made their industrial revolution and feeded predatory colonial extractivism. They have an historical debt with the planet Earth and with humanity. We need to value the Paris Agreement and the Climate Convention instead of outsourcing climate responsibilities for the global South. Brazil is recovering its protagonism on the environmental agenda. The coordination with other developing countries that carry tropical forests to act as the climate change copes and biodiversity copes will be vital to give way to our interests. In the summit meeting in the Amazon rainforest that was held some days ago was a landmark for the necessary construction of a sustainable development model with more fairness. Our resources should not be exploited for the benefit of few, but valued and placed to service all, and above all, for the well-being of the local populations. And more than that, so that the promises that were already done by the rich countries should be fulfilled, climate financing and biodiversity should be truly new and additional in relationship to the traditional financing to development. We need an international financial system that, instead of feeding the inequalities, should help the medium and low-income countries to implement structural changes. This will only happen with an adequate representation of the Bretton Woods institutions and their climatic funds. Foreign indebtedness refrains sustainable development. It's inadmissible that the developing countries should be penalized with interest rates that are 8 times higher than the ones that are charged in the rich countries. It is necessary to increase liquidity, to enhance concessional financing, and last but not the least, the conditionalities. The trade multilateral system should be reactivated so it can come back and act as a tool for fair trade, predictable, equitable, and non-discriminatory. No one anymore remembers the development round of the WTO. The decarbonization of our economies should be followed by the job creation with dignity, industrialization, and green infrastructure and public services for all. Through the new development bank, we can offer our own alternatives for adequate financing that will meet the needs of the global South. I'm sure that under the leadership of my sister Dilma Rousseff, the bank will manage to face these challenges. The creation of a common valid unit for our trade transactions and investments for the BRICS countries will increase our payment options and reduce our vulnerabilities. Presidents, today, and guests, today the BRICS are fully consolidated as a brand and as a political asset of strategic value. The participation of dozens of heads of government and state tomorrow in the enhanced session will represent an historical landmark. The interest of many countries to join the BRICS is the recognition of its growing relevance. And also, we will have a troika at the G20 as members of the BRICS in the period 2023. And so it's another opportunity for us to make advancement of the concerns of the global South with the inequalities and with sustainable development. That the momentum that motivated the creation of BRICS 15 years ago continue to inspire us in building a multipolar, fair, and inclusive international order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Lula da Silva, for taking us down memory lane particularly in relation to the composition of the BRICS family. You relate to us how, for instance, South Africa attended as a candidate member and thereafter was added to BRICS as a member, and that in itself strengthened the BRICS family. We once again stand at another momentous moment when more than 20 other countries are seeking to be part of the BRICS family. And I know that as BRICS leaders, you are discussing this matter and giving close attention to it, and you will need to make your decisions known. Your commitment to contribute to achieving a peaceful world, something that is appreciated, and your other views that you expressed are also most appreciated. The empowerment of women is something that has a great deal of resonance with most of us here, as are your views on climate change and how the resources of various countries should be used for the benefit of all. So thank you very much for your remarks in that regard. It is now my pleasure to ask President Vladimir Putin to have his moment to speak. He'll be participating through the virtual platform.
Thanks a lot. President Ramaphosa, distinguished President Lula, distinguished Prime Minister Modi, President Xi, dear colleagues, at the outset, I would like to thank South African friends for what they have done during their presidency, during their chairmanship this year. The colleagues before me have already given positive assessment of the BRICS activities. And in general, certainly we share these assessments. Our group of 5 countries has rightly proved to be a credible entity on the global arena with ever-growing influence in global affairs. The strategic course of BRICS is aimed at the future, and it meets the aspirations of the main part of the international community, the so-called global majority. By acting in concert on the principles of equality, partnership, support, and account for each other's interests, we deal with the most pressing issues of global and regional agenda. The main important thing is that BRICS stands for a multipolar world order that is equitable and built on international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter, including respect for the right of every people to its own development path. Some countries promote their hegemony, exceptionality, and their policy of the ongoing colonialism and neo-colonialism. I would like to note that the aspiration to preserve their hegemony in the world led to a dire crisis in Ukraine. At first, with the help of Western countries, an anti-constitutional coup d'etat was carried out in this country. After that, those people who did not agree with this coup faced a war. A war was unleashed against them, a war of attrition, and it lasted for 8 years. Russia decided to support people that fight for their culture, for their traditions, for their language and their future. Our actions in Ukraine are guided by only one thing: to put an end to the war that was unleashed by the West against people in Donbass. We thank our colleagues within BRICS that take an active part in the attempts to put an end to this situation and to ensure just settlement by peaceful means. Dear colleagues, the main thing is that we unanimously stand for the shaping of the multipolar world order, which is genuinely equitable and which is building on international law. The BRICS countries are building up their potential. As was said, the BRICS countries are home to over 3 billion persons, and their share in global GDP as per purchasing power parity of the so-called G7. Over the past decades, BRICS investment to global economy have doubled, and the cumulative export reached 20% of the overall indicator. We are successfully implementing the strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership 2025. Namely, we are strengthening the bilateral cooperation on such areas as diversification of supply chains, de-dollarization and transfer to local currencies in our mutual settlements, digital economy, support for small and medium enterprises, just transfer of technologies, and naturally, the active part in these processes is played by business community. A great deal of effort is invested within the BRICS Business Council and the BRICS Women's Business Alliance that the host of our meeting, President Ramaphosa, indicated. The leaders of these organizations are present at this meeting. An important priority for the BRICS interaction is the establishment of new sustainable, safe transport routes. In my address to the BRICS Business Forum, I talked about the importance of a speedy development of transcontinental routes, such as the North-South corridor that would link Russian Northern Sea and Baltic ports to sea terminals in the Gulf and in the Indian Ocean. In the future, it would ensure the annual transit of up to 30 million tons of cargo. We believe that it is high time to establish a BRICS Permanent Commission on Transport that would deal not only with the North-South project, but in broader terms, it would deal with logistics and transport corridors development, both interregional and global ones. Should the partners agree to that, the Russian side could work on this idea within its chairmanship in 2024. And certainly, we welcome strengthened interaction within BRICS in terms of global innovations. We look forward to a more active cooperation within the BRICS Global Research Advanced Infrastructure Network. It could be supported and developed by the Special Trust Fund. For its part, Russia is ready to share its experience and best practices, including when it comes to digital transformation and the use of artificial intelligence. We also seek to actively participate in the implementation of the achieved arrangements on the establishment of the Joint Working Group on Nuclear Medicine. We seek to swiftly switch into practice the work of the BRICS TVET Cooperation Alliance. We wholeheartedly support the proposal of South African colleagues to organize a separate ministerial on women affairs. Their role in political, economic and social life of our states should definitely be enhanced. Dear colleagues, next year, Russia will assume BRICS chairmanship. Our chairmanship will have the following motto: strengthening multilateralism for just global development and security. We plan to have some 200 political, economic and public events that will be hosted by over dozen Russian cities. At the same time, the BRICS summit is scheduled for October 2024. It will take place in the city of Kazan. The specific dates will be agreed upon with colleagues via diplomatic channels. We'll also have events in the format that has proved its relevance. I'm talking about BRICS Plus and BRICS Outreach. During our chairmanship, we would like to do our utmost to efficiently facilitate the implementation of decisions adopted at this summit, including with regard to the expansion of BRICS. We will coordinate closely with partners on foreign policy matters. We will jointly work on key international platforms, primarily within the United Nations. We will continue regular meetings of BRICS national security advisors. Certainly, we will prioritize such urgent tasks as combating terrorism and the spread of terrorist ideology, as well as combating money laundering and return of assets gained by criminal means. By the way, we thank partners for their support within the Financial Action Task Force. We hope that we will keep such spirit of solidarity in the future. We will contribute to comprehensive implementation of the Strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership 2025 and the development of new long-term guidelines for cooperation. This includes, in our view, increasing the role of states in international monetary and financial system, the development of interbank cooperation, expanding the use of local currencies and deepening interaction between tax, customs and anti-monopoly agencies. Naturally, Russian priorities include bolstered partnership in science and innovation, healthcare, education, the development of humanitarian ties in general. Cultural and civilizational diversity is one of the pillars of the new multipolar world order, and it means the establishment of integral free space for cultural exchange, art and creativity. As we see it, it's high time for partners within BRICS, as well as the SCO and the Community of Independent States and other countries, to have a serious conversation on the future of culture in the world, on preserving and multiplying global cultural heritage. By the way, such dialogue could be held within the 9th International Cultural Forum, which is scheduled to take place in the city of St. Petersburg from November 16th to 18th. And certainly, Russia will continue to contribute to contacts in sports and youth exchanges. Namely, in June 2024, we plan to have the BRICS Games. We would be happy to welcome teams from the BRICS nations at the next year's international competition, the Games of the Future. They will take place in the city of Kazan. This is a mix of dynamic sports and popular video games and technological devices. A good opportunity for contacts and friendly talks will be given by the World Youth Festival that will take place in March next year in the city of Sochi. In conclusion, let me once again highlight that Russia, during its chairmanship, will interact in the most constructive way with BRICS partners in order to further enhance the role and credibility of BRICS. Without any doubt, this credibility will only grow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, President Putin, for your input in this regard. You're absolutely right that BRICS has proven itself to be a credible entity that acts in solidarity, that seeks to promote a more equitable global system. And thank you also for the recognition of the efforts that are being made by a number of BRICS countries to bring about a peaceful end to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We agree that in the end, this type of conflict is best brought about to an end by negotiation, which you have said you have always been ready for. The BRICS members will continue to be supportive of various efforts to bring this conflict to an end through dialogue, mediation, and negotiation. And thank you for your thoughts also about the support that needs to be given to small, medium enterprises. That is appreciated. And the women empowerment process that needs to be enhanced. That too, we truly appreciate. And you've made comments about the reform of international financial systems. That too is a matter that the BRICS needs to be seized with. And the BRICS leaders in retreat yesterday did talk about this, and an announcement in this regard will be finalized. And the cultural advancement culminating in the BRICS Games is something that also has a great deal of resonance amongst the BRICS leaders. So thank you very much indeed. It now gives me pleasure to ask the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of the Republic of India, to take the podium. Prime Minister.
Excellency,
Rashtrapati Ramaphosa, Excellency, Rashtrapati Lula da Silva, Excellency, Rashtrapati Putin,
Excellency President Putin,
Excellency, Rashtrapati Xi,
Excellency President Xi,
ladies and gentlemen, 15वें ब्रिक्स समिट के भव्य आयोजन और हमारे आतिथ्य सत्कार के लिए मैं प्रिय मित्र राष्ट्रपति रामाफोसा को एक बार फिर से बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं। जोहानिसबर्ग जैसे खूबसूरत शहर में एक बार फिर आना
मेरे और मेरे डेलीगेशन के लिए
É um grande prazer para mim.
इस शहर का भारत के लोगों और भारत के इतिहास से पुराना गहरा संबंध है। यहाँ से कुछ दूर ही टॉल्स्टॉय फार्म है, जिसका निर्माण महात्मा गांधी ने
A short distance away from here is Tolstoy Farm that Mahatma Gandhi built 110 years ago. By bringing together the great philosophies of Eurasia and Africa, Mahatma Gandhi laid a strong foundation for our unity and mutual harmony. Excellencies, the last 2 decades have been a long and magnificent journey for BRICS. We have had many achievements during this journey. Our new development bank is playing an important role in the development of the countries of the Global South. Through its contingency reserve arrangement, we have created a financial safety net. Through initiatives such as the BRICS Satellite Constellation, the Vaccine R&D Center, mutual recognition of pharma products, we are bringing about positive changes in the lives of ordinary citizens in BRICS countries. Through initiatives such as the Youth Summit, BRICS Games, the Think Tanks Council, we are strengthening people-to-people ties between all countries. In order to give the BRICS agenda new direction, India has given some suggestions, such as the Railway Research Network, the online BRICS database, close cooperation between MSMEs and a startup forum. I am pleased that significant progress has been made in all these areas. Excellencies, in order to further expand our close cooperation, I would like to place before you a few suggestions. The first is cooperation in the area of space. We have already been working on a BRICS satellite constellation. Taking a step forward, we can think about creating a BRICS space exploration consortium. Under this, we can work on areas such as space research and weather monitoring for global good. My second suggestion is cooperation in the areas of education, skill development, and technology. In order to make BRICS a future-ready organization, we must make our societies future-ready. Technology can play an important role in this regard. In order to provide access to education for children living in remote and rural areas in India, we have created the Diksha platform, that is digital infrastructure for knowledge sharing. At the same time, in order to promote innovation among school children, we have created 10,000 Atal Tinkering Labs across the country in order to remove language barriers. An AI-based language platform, Bhashini, is being used. The CoWIN platform has been made to manage vaccinations through our digital public infrastructure, that is the India Stack. Public service delivery is being revolutionized. Diversity is one of India's greatest strengths. The solution to any problem found in India has withstood the test of this diversity, and therefore these solutions can easily be implemented in any part of the world. In this regard, we will be pleased to share with BRICS partners all these platforms developed in India. My third suggestion is that in order to identify each other's strengths, we can carry out together a skills mapping exercise. Through this, we can complement each other in the development journey. My fourth suggestion relates to big cats. In all 5 BRICS countries, various species of big cats can be found in large numbers. Under the International Big Cat Alliance, we can make joint efforts for their protection. My fifth suggestion relates to traditional medicine. All our countries have traditional medicine ecosystems. Can we together create a repository of traditional medicine? Excellencies, under South Africa's presidency, countries of the Global South have been given special importance in BRICS. We heartily welcome this. This is not just an expectation of the present times, but a necessity as well. Under its G20 presidency, India has given this subject the highest priority. Based on our core value, one earth, one family, one future, we are making efforts to move forward together with all countries. In the Voice of Global South Summit organized in January earlier this year, 125 countries participated and shared their concerns and priorities. We have also proposed permanent membership for the African Union in the G20. I am confident that all BRIC partners are also together in the G20 and that all will support our proposal, giving a special place to all these efforts within BRICS as well will further boost the morale of countries of the Global South. Excellencies, India fully supports the expansion of BRICS membership, and we welcome moving forward on this based on consensus. In 2016, during India's presidency, we had defined BRICS as a group building responsive, inclusive, and collective solutions. 7 years later, we can say that BRICS will be breaking barriers, revitalizing economies, inspiring innovation, creating opportunities, and shaping the future. Together with all BRICS partners, we will continue to contribute actively to make this new definition meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Modi, for your very insightful remarks. Would like to particularly thank you, South Africa, for reminding us of the journey that Mahatma Gandhi started here in South Africa and what he imparted to our forebears in South Africa in the modes of struggle. He was one who was strong on resistance. He taught us passive resistance, which he perfected, and we escalated to various acts of boycotts against the apartheid system. And through that, we were able to encourage citizen activism, and the organizations that were involved in our struggle, like the African National Congress and others, mobilized our people to fight against apartheid and finally to defeat it. So Mahatma Gandhi played a very important role in the history of South Africa. Thank you for reminding us. Would like to congratulate India, particularly as you speak about the need for cooperation in space. In a few hours, India's spacecraft Chandrayaan-3 will be landing on the moon. We congratulate you. This, for us as the BRICS family, is a momentous occasion, and we rejoice with you. We join you in the joy of this great achievement. But we also thank you for making the proposal that there should perhaps be a BRICS space cooperation system which can be looked at. It's a very forward-looking proposal. And your proposals on the development of skills is something that we appreciate and has great support amongst all of us. And thank you very much for also mentioning the issue about big cats. We were pleased as South Africa to donate cheetahs to India, and you informed me that the cheetahs arrived well and they are alive in India. And I told you that we are willing and prepared to donate even more, because you are a country that takes care of big cats. So we thank you for that. So should you need more cheetahs, you've come to the home of cheetahs. On the issue of traditional medicines repository, we have a very big community of people who are involved in traditional medicine here in South Africa. So we're willing to cooperate, and I'm sure the same obtains with all other members of BRICS. And this you will find great support for amongst all of us to create a traditional medicines repository. So that would be good to heal all the ailments. We should not just continue being dependent on Western medicines. We should be also dependent on our own traditional medicines. We appreciate your focus on the Global South, and also for having had this meeting of 125 countries participating. The Global South should now continue to be our area of focus, and we appreciate that. We want to wish you well as you continue to prepare to host the G20 summit, at which you have invited us, and we will surely participate. And we are heartened to hear that India supports the expansion of BRICS. This is a matter that we are discussing, and hopefully we will find a clear solution to this matter as we discuss it amongst ourselves as BRICS leaders. So we thank you very much. My honor now to call on His Excellency President Xi Jinping to take the floor and address us. President Xi Jinping.
Your Excellency, President Cyril Ramaphosa, Your Excellency, President Lula da Silva, Your Excellency, President Vladimir Putin, Your Excellency, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We gather at a time when the world is undergoing major shifts, division, and regrouping. It has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation. We, the BRICS countries, should always bear in mind our founding purpose of strengthening ourselves through unity, act on a strong sense of responsibility, enhance cooperation across the board, and promote high-quality development so as to bring to the world more certainty, stability, and positive energy. We should deepen business and financial cooperation to boost economic growth. Development is an inalienable right of all countries. It is not a privilege reserved for a few. The world economic recovery remains shaky, with less than 3% of growth for the year, as estimated by some international institutions. Challenges for developing countries are even more formidable, hampering their efforts to realize the sustainable development goals. We BRICS countries should be fellow companions on the journey of development and revitalization, and oppose decoupling and supply chains disruption, as well as economic coercion. We should focus on practical cooperation, particularly in such fields as digital economy, green development, and supply chain, and bolster economic, trade, and financial exchanges. China will set up a China BRICS Science and Innovation Incubation Park for the new era to support the deployment of innovation results. Under the BRICS Remote Sensing Satellite Constellation Mechanism, We will explore the establishment of a BRICS global remote sensing satellite data and application cooperation platform to provide data support for agriculture, ecological conservation, and disaster reduction in various countries. China will also work with all parties to jointly establish a BRICS framework on industrial cooperation for sustainable development. As a platform of industrial coordination and project cooperation in implementing the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We should expand political and security cooperation to uphold peace and tranquility. The Cold War mentality is still haunting our world, and the geopolitical situation is getting tense. BRICS countries should keep to the direction of peaceful development and consolidate the BRICS strategic partnership. We need to make good use of the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting, the meeting of high representatives on national security and other mechanisms, support each other on issues concerning our respective core interests, and enhance coordination on major international and regional issues. We need to tender good offices on hotspot issues, pushing for political settlement and lowering the temperature. Artificial intelligence is a new frontier of development. It may generate enormous development dividends, but also harbors risks and challenges. Our 5 countries have agreed to launch the AI study group of BRICS Institute of Future Networks at an early date. We need to enable the study group to play its full role, further expand cooperation on AI, and step up information exchange and technological cooperation. We need to jointly fend off risks and develop AI governance frameworks and standards with broad-based consensus. So as to make AI technologies more secure, reliable, controllable, and equitable. We should increase people-to-people exchanges and promote mutual learning between civilizations. There are many civilizations and development paths in the world, and this is how the world should be. Human history will not end with a particular civilization or system. BRICS countries need to champion the spirit of inclusiveness and advocate peaceful coexistence and harmony between civilizations. We should respect all modernization paths that each country chooses on its own, and oppose ideological rivalry, systemic confrontation, and clash of civilizations. We need to make good use of such mechanisms as the BRICS Seminar on Governance, the BRICS Forum on People-to-People and Cultural Exchanges, and the Women Innovation Contest to deepen people-to-people exchanges and strengthen the bond between our peoples. China would like to propose that BRICS countries expand cooperation on education, enhance the role of the BRICS Alliance for vocational education, explore and set up a cooperation mechanism on digital education, and foster a paradigm of all-round cooperation on education. In addition, we also need to strengthen exchanges on traditional cultures and promote the renewal of the fine traditional cultures. We should uphold fairness and justice and improve global governance. Strengthening global governance is the right choice if the international community intends to share development opportunities and tackle global challenges. International rules must be written and upheld jointly by all countries, based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, rather than dictated by those with the strongest muscles or the loudest voice. Ganging up to form exclusive groups and packaging their own rules as international norms are even more unacceptable. BRICS countries should practice true multilateralism, stick to solidarity and oppose division, uphold the UN-centered international system, support and strengthen the WTO-centered multilateral trading system, and reject the attempt to create small circles or exclusive blocs. We need to fully leverage the role of the new development bank, push forward reform of the international financial and monetary systems, and increase the representation and voice of developing countries. I am glad to see the growing enthusiasm of developing countries about BRICS, about participating in BRICS cooperation, and quite a number of them have applied to join the BRICS cooperation mechanism. We need to make good use of the BRICS Plus cooperation format and accelerate the BRICS expansion process to bring more countries into the BRICS family, so as to pool our strengths, pool our wisdom to make global governance more just and equitable. Colleagues, as an ancient Chinese saying goes, designs for justice prevail, and acts for the benefit of the people succeed. The cause of BRICS champions international justice and benefits the peoples of our 5 countries. It will grow steady and strong and make greater contributions to world peace and development. Thank you.
Leaders of the BRICS member countries have just delivered statements at their opening session of the BRICS summit this year. This is the 15th BRICS summit. And for more on that, let's cross live to our reporter Zhao Yingfei in Johannesburg. Hello, Yingfei. Tell us more on President Xi Jinping's remarks at the open session of the summit.
Well, all 5 members of the BRIC countries have all delivered speech this morning here in Johannesburg, and it was interesting that the organizers have put President Xi's speech at the very last, so you can see that the importance of his speech. And President Xi has just delivered his 5 to 7 minute long speech, and he have explained the cooperation among BRICS members in 3 different levels: financial, political, and cultural levels. He first started his speech explaining the current situation, the changing global landscape, and therefore he called for strengthening of cooperation between BRICS members. And he says in terms of business cooperation, saying that the members should enhance and boost the economy given the post-pandemic era and the economic recovery. He addresses the difficulties of economic recovery and therefore called for cooperation of green development as well as digital economy. And he also mentioned about the China Plus and BRICS Science Innovation Hub. And those are one of the perspectives that can enhance the economy growth. And also he explained it from the political level. He said that all countries should strengthen political security cooperation. And he mentioned about the Cold War mentality and saying that the BRICS members should strengthen the cooperation in peaceful development. And from the civilization level, he mentioned about the people-to-people exchange. He mentioned about that all countries should enhance mutual learning between the civilization, given the fact that we should acknowledge the coexistence of the different cultures. He also saying that all different countries should respect the modernization path and improve global governance, so that the BRICS mechanism, all countries can take advantage of those mechanisms to further boost the cooperation, to respect each other's culture. Now, President Xi at the end of the speech mentioned about the general theme of BRICS, the multilateralism as well as solidarity, and those are basically the major path and major outcomes that all countries, all members of BRICS would like to pursue by the end of this summit. Now back to you.
Thank you very much, our reporter Zhao Yunfei in Johannesburg. Now here's a correction here. The order of the leaders' speeches are not actually arranged by the importance or the content of each speech, but it's quite straightforward. South Africa is the host nation this year, so the South African president speaks first. Then it goes with the letter B, R-I-C. B means Brazil, R, Russia, I, India, and C, China. So for more insight into those leaders' remarks, let's talk to our studio guests. So gentlemen, I believe you listened very carefully to these 5 statements from leaders of BRICS member states. How about we start with Chinese President Xi Jinping's remarks? He mentioned this very important period. The world is now entering a new stage of turbulence and changes. Do you think, Professor Gao, do you think this has set the context of future BRICS development?
First of all, I think President Xi Jinping really made a very important speech. He was very macro, and he was very philosophical, and he also has a historical depth to the points that he has made. And he also is not only talking about China and the BRICS, he's talking about the global international community at large. He's also talking about the major thresholds that mankind is faced with right now: war or peace, stability or turmoil. And I think this really hits all the important nails on the head. And I think he also talked about what the BRICS countries need to do in terms of enlargement of the membership, but also what will be the right decisions for example, opposing the new Cold War mentality, to oppose the so-called small blocs, for example, which try to divide the international community into opposing blocs. And I think he also emphasized very importantly that the BRICS member states need to cooperate in political sense as well as in terms of security matters. And all these, I think, are very important things, because from the Chinese perspective, President Xi Jinping was absolutely right to mention that we value stability, we value peace. Without stability and peace, you cannot expect to develop. So all these things from the Chinese perspective are interrelated with each other. And we not only want to talk about this from the Chinese perspective, we want to project this image from the 5 BRICS countries perspective, and we want to really make sure that these 5 BRICS countries can stick together, can emphasize, as President Xi Jinping said, on the importance of unity and keep away the danger of disunity, for example, especially when the world is in great turmoil.
And also to remember the founding purpose of this grouping. I think President Xi Jinping's remarks are not only about macro observations, but also about very specific proposals. Mr. Tangen, what impresses the most?
Well, he was talking about innovation, creating a center.
Science Innovation Incubation Park of the BRICS?
Yes, yeah. But I want to make a larger comment. I mean, what he proposed was equally saying, here's things we should do, here's things we shouldn't do. And obviously, by reference, a lot of those things belong to the United States. And what he's doing is pointing to a watershed moment in history. He said, things are changing. We either have to adapt a forward-going idea about governance and working together and based on multipolarity, or we're going to be stuck in a past which is not going to work. because it's hanging on to this idea of hegemony, of creating, you're an enemy because you're not with me. You're an enemy because you're rising. These things cannot continue. But there are a lot of positive things. He talked about the role of education, all of these things, and civilization. And I think, if you really look at his statement, he covers the three initiatives that he's always talked about. Security. No country can go forward without being secure. Development. All of these countries want development. And the third, and very importantly, although it's often overlooked, is civilization, understanding. As you said before, you cannot deal with somebody unless you understand them. They can't trust you because you don't even know what they're talking about. So the basis of understanding, trust, is education, understanding each other. And this is something that cannot be ignored in a multipolar world. So by saying, let's have cooperative groups like this, innovation forum, these are the types of things that draw people together. And, I was very impressed by the fact that he drew an overall framework for multilateral development going into the future, a little bit different from his compatriots.
Well, gentlemen, we'll be getting back to you on this. And for more on the leader's remarks, let's cross live to my colleague Tian Wei in Johannesburg. Hello, Tian Wei.
Hello, Pandang, and thanks to our guest in the Beijing studio for the in-depth analysis. As all of you have illustrated, the speeches given by leaders from the BRICS countries have attracted large crowds from all over the world. Journalists sitting in the media center where I am really taking notes every step of the way. Looking at the speeches given, among them the one given by Chinese President Xi Jinping as the last speaker at the opening session. And to comment about that, with me we have Thembisa Fakude, who is the Senior Research Fellow from the Africa-Asia Dialogue. In fact, Thembisa is based here in Johannesburg. It's good to see you, Thembisa.
Thanks very much.
You were listening to it very clearly throughout the speeches. So it seems that the Chinese president, as the guest in Beijing also illustrated, touched on several important points. One is business and financial cooperation. The other is, of course, the political agenda of the BRICS. Meanwhile, he also brings a lot of attention to artificial intelligence, some of the latest trends, and also about the exchanges and international governance among the BRICS and also beyond. So among all of these points, what are some of the things you picked up?
Well, I think it was a very important speech, breath of fresh air actually, because it talks about youth, it talks about artificial intelligence,
yes.
It talks about the future of Africa. In other words, it talks about the attempts and plans by China to come and invest in technology in Africa, which is something that we need. Less so about politics, which I think was good, because we can't eat politics. We need investment. We need to prepare our future generation and make them fit for purpose for future. And I think that's what President Xi touched on, which I think was great, and it was well received. I was looking at the expression of some of the politicians who were cutaways. You could see that it was really well received because it talks of the future of Africa.
Right. A lot of things is about delivery. It's not just about let's do this or let's think about this. It's let's get it done already. He talked about the China BRICS Science and Technology Incubation Park, the satellite data and exchange for better agriculture. As we know, we are talking about developing economies. And meanwhile, he's been talking about the AI study group, which is going to be established, and the specific functions of this AI study group. And at the same time, the new development bank, which of course already well in operation. So delivery, implementation, extremely important. This is not just talk.
It's not just talk, and I think it came at the right place at the right time, because President Cyril Ramaphosa is now assuming his leadership as an African or Pan-Africanist leader. And I think President Xi spoke to that, basically addressing this to President Cyril Ramaphosa, to say that we are ready, able, and willing to partner with Africa, not necessarily South Africa, in terms of ensuring that we prepare the future of South Africa and Africa in general for purpose. And I'm glad that it's technology that China is talking about in investing by and large is also about AI, which is something very important.
Right.
And that comes, I think, it will land in a fertile ground in Africa, because Africa is actually hungry for training. It's hungry for the investment, particularly in technology. And I think, for lack of a better term, it was a very PR type of a speech which is going to be very, very well received throughout Africa, because Africa, that's what is looking for at the moment.
Obviously, all the presidents are addressing the audiences back at home and also who are listening today among the BRICS and even beyond. It seems that some of them have already gotten some of the most important points. Having said that, though, we talk about several important things about the future on BRICS cooperation. Several things: digital, green, supply chain, sustainable development. All of these are the key words, seems, coming from Chinese President Xi's speech. So obviously, these are also trends of the future. So we are not just talking about before. We're not just talking about principles, but let's forward-looking, and also about the future of BRICS as well, which President Ramaphosa also clearly mentioned.
Yeah, I think the Chinese trajectory is very important because it emphasizes more on benefiting Africa. We've had other
or benefiting BRICS and developing countries.
Correct, but in this regard, I think Africa is one country that's been targeted.
Absolutely.
I had the presentation of other leaders who were more nationalistic in a way, but President Xi's speech was basically saying we are ready and willing to partner with Africa in moving forward. Other leaders who spoke, except for President Lula, were talking about their countries and how we should partner with their countries. But we didn't hear that much from President Xi. It was more about giving. It was more about a welfare, in inverted commas, speech to Africans to say China is willing to partner with Africa, China is willing to assist Africa.
At the same time, I did notice that President Ramaphosa, in his very opening speech of the BRICS Leaders Summit, he talked about every country, their cooperation with Africa. He specifically described this, if I remember right, not the exact quote, but the way he said it. He said, China has chosen to assist the development of Africa. That's something quite accurate, I guess, in this context that you just mentioned. Having said that, though, we do see important political agenda. After all, these are political leaders.
Sure.
They talk about politics and geopolitics. So about that, the Chinese president talked about the enhancing of coordination on important issues, international issues, on hotspot issues which certainly have an impact on our developing economies and the global south. He also talked about the fairness of international governance, international financial systems, so the WTO-centered international trade systems. How important are these now for the BRICS as they move forward and really looking to the future? How will the BRICS leaders, when they are meeting today, tomorrow, likely to implement all of these visions they talk about?
Well, I think they are going to be able to implement them, but again, President Xi was careful in terms of giving broad strokes in talking about hotspots. He didn't mention the hotspots, but he talked about hotspots, and we all know what hotspots are, which I think was more diplomatic, but the point was driven home.
Yes.
The other issue was about the multilateral system that he talked about, which is basically the expansion of the United Nations Security Council, because that's what Africans, particularly South Africa, has been talking about, that we need to expand and at least admit an African country or a country from the global south into the United Nations Security Council. I think that's what he was speaking about, because that's what they're calling for.
Multilateralism, upholding it, and against the blocks, that's also his exact word. And meanwhile, at the same time, make sure there's more participation of all the voices. We are almost running out of time, my friend. But having said that, though, this is only the beginning.
Yeah.
Of the conversations taking place here among the BRICS leaders. Now, it's going to be Africa, but it's also going to be BRICS plus Africa. Certainly, observers are watching from all over the world. So this is in the African continent, your hometown, to the rest of the world. What do you expect as an analyst, as a citizen of Johannesburg, and certainly of African continent, should be achieved by these leaders?
Well, one is investment.
Investment.
Technology. Giving attention to conflicts and hotspots, as President Xi has said, and also pushing the inclusion of African countries in this international multilateralism.
Well said. There are a lot of issues on the agenda. Certainly, as the Chinese philosopher Confucius said, not all things can be resolved one time, but as long as we take the steps, we will be there. So I want to thank you, my friend, for participating in this discussion. Let's continue to watch very closely. The BRICS Summit is taking place here in Johannesburg. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for this section of our coverage from our live studio in the Sandton Center of Johannesburg on the sideline of the BRICS Leaders Summit. As the agenda evolves and continues, CGTN is here to bring you all the latest information together with our colleagues in the Beijing studio. Now back to you, Pandang.
Thank you very much, my colleague Tian Wei in Johannesburg. Now, for more insight, let's talk to our guests in the Beijing studio. So, gentlemen, we've talked quite a lot about the role of the new development bank, the financial institution of the BRICS. We know it's one of its visions, if you will, is to raise funds in diverse world markets in different currencies. Now, after listening to the remarks from the leaders of the 5 BRICS members, have you now got a clearer understanding of the NDB, the New Development Bank's vision for the future, Professor Zhou?
Well, I think NDB has a lot of responsibilities, because without financing being properly lined up, you really cannot engage in all these major connectivity projects or even mega projects in terms of manufacturing and industrialization. So I think the expectation now is very clear. Great expectation for the New Development Bank to play a major role in the financing of connectivity projects and overall industrial modernization projects involving the 5 BRICS countries. Now, for the 5 BRICS countries, each one is a little bit different in terms of demand and supply of capital. And therefore, I think the New Development Bank really has a lot to do to understand better where the demand is, and also to pinpoint the exact pockets of fund that they can raise money from. And now that the international situation is more and more complicated, the New Development Bank really need to be tailor-made in terms of targeting where the money is, where the demand is, and try to intermediate in between. Now, fortunately, in addition to the New Development Bank, as far as China is concerned, China also has many other financial institutions which are dedicated to helping many countries, including the 5 BRIC member countries themselves, to line up proper finances. So I think the New Development Bank is not acting completely solo in this very important area. They need to coordinate better with other Chinese financial institutions, with other international financial institutions, to make sure that the infrastructure connectivity projects and other industrial projects involving the 5 BRICS countries will not run out of money when they get executed.
Right, since we're talking about this, let's get more voices. Eduardo Castro of Brazil's BAN Group spoke to Dr. Jose Ricardo dos Santos Luz Jr., co-chairman and CEO of Leader China, on the settlement of local currencies during the BRICS summit.
Will you use one of the currencies, or 2 of them, 4 of them, to do business among the countries that are part of BRICS today, or are they going to begin with something new and create another currency?
During the forum, there was a big discussion of which currency is going to be. There is a Russian club, a Russian think tank club, which gave this idea of the R5, which is the Brazilian real, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee, the Chinese renminbi, and also the South African rand. So it's R5 with the R of the first letter of each currency. So they are discussing how it's going to be implemented, which sort of currencies, which sort of basket that they were going to use, if they're going to transform this into bonds, or if they're going to use the gold to be the reserve. So there's a big room for discussion. But look, it's the beginning.
Very
beginning, Eduardo.
Yes.
It's the same that I would say between Brazil and China. We are already using the yuan, the renminbi, in the exchanges between this bilateral trade, which the main advantages are the cost efficiency and also the time length.
Yeah, leaving the dollar away also,
Do you
right?
think yuan has this potential to be the main currency between our countries in the BRICS?
Honestly, I strongly believe, Eddie, that at the first beginning, the countries, the bilateral exchanges would be between the countries of each one. But in the end, as far as that experience comes between Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, I strongly believe that the R5 has a huge potential to be used. But again, it takes time. And we have to understand what is going to be the criteria for that. Because I'm not talking that we should replace US dollar. No, dollar is important in all world. In international trade, we have been using this for decades. But what is my opinion is that we are using the US, the other countries' currencies, such as the R5, as an alternative of the US dollar. I mean, do not be so dependent on US dollar. That's my point.
Well, gentlemen, besides NDB, financing mechanisms, currency settlements, BRICS' own expansion is a hot topic this year for sure. Mr. Tangen, what would you say that can distinguish an expanded BRICS in the future from existing groupings like G7 and G20?
Well, you have to understand where they came from. They were always there to provide a solution. The G7 at one time was, the overwhelming GDP of the world, but they couldn't cut it. So G20 was created to deal with the financial situation. And now you have the emergence of the BRICS, middle powers who are seeking a way not only for themselves, but also the developing world going forward. It is not about politics. It's not like the G7 is going to go to war with BRICS, but they have different interests because of the groupings. So look for look for the BRICS to continue expanding, but in the way that was, I think, outlined most equitably, first by Ramaphosa, but then by Xi Jinping. That this is a cooperative mechanism that has legitimacy. Remember, if you go to what we're talking about between Russia and Ukraine, the U.S., Russia doesn't trust them. They don't trust Europe because Europe admitted that they lied about going along with the first two peace proposals. So there has to be credibility, trust. And right now, that trust and credibility is with the BRICS, and so they are the next, quote, solution group. But it's not about vying for, legitimacy. It's about what you can do.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tangen and Professor Gao there. And let's hear more from Mr. Eduardo Castro and Dr. Jose Ricardo dos Santos Luz Jr.
How big do you think? How big and how fast do you think BRICS are going to be? And in terms of getting bigger, because it's inevitable that some countries are going to join. 22 of them had made the official request.
Well, first of all, the criteria will be about having consensus. So we have to promote more debate between the BRICS countries in order to find a consensus between them. Some of them want to push, some of them want to slow down or not go too fast as the others expect. So this is the first point. The second point, I would compare the situation of the BRICS economies with the Brazil and China economy. If you have, for example, in 2003, Brazil-China economy, the total trade was of 2.3 billion US. And now in 2022, the last number, the last year, was of almost 150 billion US. And this is something that is also this sort of growth of the economy between Brazil and China is something also going on between Russia and China, between the other BRICS countries. And this is something that I strongly believe that they will increase as more the BRICS plus member countries will adhere to this initiative, because adhering to this initiative, there will gonna be a lot of incentives in trade, incentives on these economies. So this global south will have, again, as I said before, more voice to express themselves and more connections between them in order to promote business in a fair and equitable way.
How do you believe that BRICS can position itself in comparison, for example, with G7, the richest nations in the world, expanding the group? How could economically we could improve the global south in these terms with expand BRICS?
To my eyes, judging about, I don't think that the BRICS countries somehow they are comparing themselves a lot with the G7 because they are finding their own way in terms of this, of building and strengthening this relationship.
It's a different path.
Yeah, it's a different path. But at the same time, I think that judging by the countries that are willing to join, such as this BRICS plus members, which is fomented also by China. China is one of the countries, as Eduardo well stated, that is really willing to push this in order to create what we say that it's building a community with a common shared future. This is what is the BRICS countries about. So they are finding their own way, and to find their own way, BRICS has to reach a consensus to see how will be the policies, how will be the boundaries for the other countries to join. Because you have Venezuela and Iran, which are suffering some of the sanctions of U.S. They are willing to go to the global south, for example. Yep. Why? Because they are going to want to be more connected with this alliance. At the same time, if you take Saudi Arabia is a very rich, full fossil state, but is willing to have an alternative to express itself, not only in this Western world, but also in the BRICS platform.
We have Brazil and Argentina, one of the biggest countries in terms of economics in South America. Argentina wants to join. We have Nigeria as an observer. South Africa is part of BRICS, the two biggest economies in Africa. So, and we have countries as different as you said, Ethiopia and Russia getting together in this group. So there's a path ahead. There's a big path ahead.
That's it for this edition of special live coverage on CGTN on the BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Pandong in Beijing. Stay tuned.